You find yourself within the stone walls of a small English priory during the quiet days of Lent, somewhere in the late 12th century. The hour is very early, long before the first pale light begins to show above the bare hills. The air inside the kitchen is cold and perfectly still, holding the memory of the night's frost which clings to the narrow window slits and to the iron of the door latch. The stones of the floor are worn smooth by many years of footsteps, and they are cold underfoot even through the thick soles of a woolen shoe. Every surface in this kitchen speaks of long use and careful keeping. The heavy oak tables scrubbed to a pale grey, the soot-blackened beams overhead, the deep fireplace with its wide arch of sooty limestone. You are not here as a stranger, but as an observer whose presence is unnoticed, simply watching as the first movements of the day begin. Against the far wall, in the deep shadows beside the hearth, a figure stirs from a low wooden stool. This is the cook, a lay sister of middle years whose name is not known to you, and whose face is often hidden by the angle of her coif or the turn of her head. She has risen before prime, while the other nuns are still in their simple cells or beginning their silent prayers in the dormitory. Her movements are slow and regular, as if she is part of the same calm machinery that turns the stars or draws the tide. There is no haste in her. The first thing she does is cross to the cold hearth where a mound of ash from the previous evening's fire still holds a faint heart of warmth. She kneels, takes a small iron shovel, and carefully scrapes away the grey ash to uncover a few embers that glow with a deep orange light. These embers had been banked the night before, covered with a layer of ash and a scattering of dry peat dust, and they have lived through the dark hours smouldering quietly. She brings a bundle of dried straw and some wisps of hay, laying them with care over the glowing embers. She lowers her head and blows gently, not in a great gust, but in a succession of soft breaths, each one coaxing a thin thread of smoke, and then a tiny yellow flame that licks up through the straw. The flame spreads with a low crackling sound, like the distant popping of seed pods in a summer field, and the kitchen begins to fill with the smell of burning grass, a clean and slightly sweet scent that rises to meet the cold air. She adds small dry twigs, each one no thicker than her finger, and then larger sticks split from an old oak log. The fire grows, settling into a quiet, steady sound, a murmur of heat that pushes back the chill. The light it casts is warm and unsteady, playing over the uneven stones of the wall and the edge of the great iron cauldron that hangs from a blackened chain above the fireplace. The cauldron is vast, large enough to hold broth for the whole community, its sides dark with years of seasoning and its bottom curved and heavy. It hangs motionless, waiting. From a hook near the hearth, the cook takes down a long iron fork and uses it to adjust the chain so the pot hangs a little lower over the strengthening fire. The iron is cold to the touch, and you can see the faint bloom of a chill mist on its surface before the heat begins to chase it away. Every small action is done with a kind of quiet patience, as if time itself moves more slowly within these walls, measured not by any mechanical device, but by the gradual warming of iron and stone. Once the fire is established, the cook moves to the kitchen's other corner, where a large wooden bucket stands on a low bench. She lifts it by its rope handle, the wood dark with moisture, and carries it out through a small side door that leads to the cloister walk. You follow in observation, hearing the door's heavy wooden latch lift and fall back into place with a soft plunk. Outside, the priory is wrapped in a deep grey half-light that is not yet dawn. The sky above the central garth is the colour of unwashed wool, and the grass in the courtyard is silvered with a fine layer of frost. The buildings around the cloister are simple and unadorned, constructed from the local limestone, which appears almost white in summer, but now holds a grey dampness, their surfaces pitted and worn. The roof tiles are covered with lichen, and the whole place smells of stone and wet earth, and a faint tang of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. The cook walks along the covered walkway, her wooden pattens making a soft, rhythmic sound on the flagstones. She passes the entrance to the chapel, from which no sound yet issues, the great wooden door closed against the cold. Her path takes her to the well which stands in a corner of the garth, a circular stone structure with a wooden windlass and a bucket of its own. The iron handle of the windlass is cold enough to burn the skin, so she works quickly but without hurry, lowering the bucket with a creak of rope and wood until you hear a distant splash. Then she turns the handle, drawing the bucket back up, the rope wet and dripping, until it reaches the rim and she tips clear, cold water into her own wooden pail. She repeats this action several times, each bucketful filling the pail with a quiet gurgle. The water is so cold that a thin mist rises from its surface when she breathes over it, and it carries the mineral scent of deep chalk, a clean and hard smell. With the full bucket she returns through the same door, and you notice now that the sky has begun very slightly to lighten, shifting from grey to a paler grey-blue at the far edge behind the chapel roof. The birds are still silent, sleeping in the ivy that climbs the eastern wall, and the only sound is the cook's footsteps, the slosh of water, and the very distant, muffled crow of a cockerel somewhere far down the valley. The priory is entirely secluded, set among low hills still bare from winter, the fields around it brown and sleeping, the woods bare branches tangled against the sky. No road passes nearby, and the silence that wraps the place seems as deep and old as the stones themselves. Back inside the kitchen, the cook sets the heavy bucket on the stone floor near the hearth, and then goes to a wooden peg on the wall from which hangs a coarse linen apron. She unfolds it, shakes it once to loosen any dust, and ties it around her waist over her habit. The habit itself is of undyed wool, a soft grey-brown, long-sleeved and full, now protected by the apron, which reaches to her ankles. Over her head she wears a simple white coif and a dark veil, but the veil is tucked back while she works, and the sleeves of her habit are pushed up to her elbows and secured with a twist of cord, leaving her forearms bare. Her hands are strong and capable, with blunt, clean nails and skin that shows the small scars and calluses of a life of work with fire and water and knife. She takes a small lamp, a simple clay dish with a wick floating in tallow, and lights it from the fire before carrying it across the kitchen to a low door set in the far wall, a door that leads down worn stone steps into the undercroft. The steps are narrow and uneven, polished by centuries of passing feet, and the air grows immediately cooler and damper as you descend. The undercroft is a long, low room with a vaulted ceiling of stone, supported by thick pillars. It smells of earth and dried herbs, and something faintly sweet, like old wood. Here the priory keeps its stores for the Lenten season. The cook moves slowly, the lamp throwing long shadows that dance and bend across the curved ceiling. She does not linger, but you see earthenware crocks, sacks of coarse cloth, strings of dried vegetation hanging from the beams, all arranged in a careful order that she knows by heart. From this cool, dark place she gathers what she will need later, but for now she merely checks and touches, making sure all is in readiness. The sound of the lamp's tiny flame is a soft hiss, the only disturbance to the profound quiet of the undercroft. When she climbs the steps again, the kitchen seems warmer by contrast, and the fire has settled into a steady bed of glowing logs. The cauldron now gives off a very faint heat, its iron surface no longer quite so chill. She pours the well water into the cauldron, bucket after bucket, the water splashing and then stilling until the pot is about half full. The sound of the water hitting the iron is a hollow, metallic, ringing tone that gradually deepens as the level rises. When the pouring is done, she hangs the bucket on a hook and uses a small wooden bowl to scoop a little water onto her hands, rubbing them clean and drying them on the corner of her apron. The routine is old and familiar. She has likely done it thousands of times. Now, as the fire continues to burn and the water in the cauldron begins its long journey from cold to warm to hot, the cook stands still for a moment. She looks toward the window slit that faces east, where the grey light has grown strong enough to see the outline of individual bare branches against the sky. The bell for prime will ring soon, calling the community to the first prayers of the day. Before it does, she uses an iron poker to shift one of the burning logs, settling the fire into an even heat, and then she walks to a small niche in the wall near the door, where a simple wooden cross hangs above a tiny bowl of holy water. She dips a finger into the water and makes a slow sign on her forehead and chest, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The gesture is brief, untheatrical, a mere moment of quiet devotion before the day's work begins in earnest. The first bell tolls then, a single deep note, followed by another and then another, the sound coming from the small bell tower above the chapel. It is not a loud sound, but it carries through the stone walls like a vibration felt in the bones. You can hear, very faintly, the soft rustle of the nuns rising, the pad of their bare or stockinged feet along the dormitory corridor, the whisper of their habits as they move toward the chapel. The cook does not go to Prime. Her duties keep her here, and the community understands that the preparation of food is itself a form of prayer when offered with the right intention. She remains in the kitchen, and the sound of the sisters chanting begins to drift over, a low melodic hum that seems to come from the very stones, so perfectly does it blend with the atmosphere of the priory. The Latin words are indistinct at this distance, but their cadence is like the gentle rise and fall of breath, a slow wave that repeats and returns. The cook picks up a long-handled wooden paddle, the principal tool of her day. It is smooth from years of immersion in boiling broth, its blade worn thin at the edge, the handle dark with use. She does not yet need to stir, for the water is barely warm, but she places it ready on a stone ledge beside the hearth, aligning it carefully with the edge. Then she takes a worn knife and begins to prepare the first vegetables, which she brought up from the undercroft earlier, a single large onion and a few small wizened turnips that have been stored through the winter. You notice the way she trims the ends, letting the brown papery skin of the onion slip away into a pile on the table, the layers revealed, glossy and white with faint purple rings. The turnips she scrubs with a rough cloth dipped in cold water, removing the last traces of storage sand, their skins purple at the crown and fading to a creamy white. The knife moves steadily, cutting each vegetable into pieces that are neither too large nor too small, just regular enough to cook evenly over many hours. The rhythm of the chopping is steady and calm, a soft percussion beneath the distant chant. Each piece is then gathered into her cupped hands and carried to the cauldron, slipping into the water with a small plop that sends tiny ripples spreading to the iron sides. The water is now faintly steaming, not yet bubbling, but the surface shimmers with the promise of heat. She adds a very little salt, a precious pinch from a small stone pot with a wooden lid, and then she pauses again, her eyes resting on the glow of the fire. The kitchen fills with the most delicate of scents, the mineral breath of the well water beginning to mingle with the earthy sweetness of onion, the subtle tang of turnip. It is not the smell of a finished meal, but the very earliest stage, a suggestion of what will come after many hours. The steam rises in thin wisps, catching the firelight and disappearing upward into the high-shadowed roof, where the rafters are lost in darkness. The cook pulls a stool closer to the hearth and sits down, not from tiredness but simply to be near the pot, to watch the slow transformation of cold water and raw vegetables into something that will sustain. She folds her hands in her lap, the rough fabric of her apron creased over her knees, and her head bows slightly. She might be praying, or she might simply be resting her mind, allowing it to become as still and clear as the water that is now starting to tremble with the first tiny bubbles clinging to the bottom of the cauldron. Time moves on, without measure, as the fire settles lower and she adds another twig, then a small log. The chanting from the chapel has ceased, and a deeper silence fills the priory, broken only by the occasional crack of a burning log and the slow, liquid sound of the water beginning its first gentle simmer. The bell will ring again for the next hour, but that is yet far off. For now, the kitchen is a small world of its own, a space of simple elements, fire, water, root, stone. The cook sits in the center of it, her breathing slow and even, her whole presence a kind of anchor for the day that is just beginning to unfold across the priory grounds. The steam from the cauldron has grown thicker now, a constant gentle column that warms your face if you were to lean close. Through the narrow window slit, the grey sky remains unchanging, still heavy with the overcast of early spring, holding back any direct sun. The light inside the kitchen remains dim and golden, a cocoon of warmth that separates this one room from the cold silence beyond the door. The cook rises after a while to stir the pot, a single slow circle of the wooden paddle that shifts the vegetables and the water in a lazy spiral. Then she lays the paddle back on the ledge and resumes her seat. Nothing more happens, and in that nothing there is a profound sense of peace, a quiet that seems to be a part of the very fabric of the priory, woven into the stone walls and the grey wool of the habits and the steady, patient work of a cook on an early Lenten morning. The cook has returned to the undercroft, this time with clear purpose, and you follow her descent once more into that low, vaulted chamber beneath the kitchen. The stone steps are the same, worn and hollowed slabs, cool through the soles of her shoes, and the air grows steadily more still and damp as you leave the warmth of the hearth behind. In one hand she carries the small clay lamp with its tallow flame, holding it slightly forward so the light spills down the steps ahead of her, casting a long, wavering yellow circle on the rough walls. The flame is a tiny thing, no larger than a thumb, but in the absolute darkness of the undercroft it becomes the center of the visible world. Its glow picking out the edges of stone pillars, the curve of the vaulted ceiling, the shapes of stored provisions that stand like silent figures in the shadows. The sound of her footsteps is a soft, regular scuff, and the hem of her habit brushes the stone with the faintest whisper of wool on rock. The undercroft is not a large space, but it is arranged with a careful economy born of long necessity. The floor is packed earth, hard and dry, scattered with clean straw in some places to absorb any damp, and the walls are the same local limestone, here left unplastered, so the marks of the mason's chisel are still visible in long, sweeping lines. There are no windows, for the chamber is partly sunk into the ground, but there is a narrow ventilation shaft in one corner that allows a thread of outside air to enter, bringing with it the cold breath of the early spring morning and the faint, distant sound of a blackbird beginning its song in the cloister garth. The cook pauses at the foot of the steps to let her eyes adjust and to lift the lamp a little higher, surveying the neat rows of storage. You sense that this is a place of great order, where every crock and sack and bundle has its appointed spot, and where nothing is wasted. Along the northern wall, a series of earthenware crocks stands on a low wooden shelf. They are of various sizes, some tall enough to reach a person's waist, others small and squat like little toads. Their glazed surfaces are a deep brown color, almost black in the low light, and each one is covered with a fitted wooden lid or a piece of oiled linen tied with twine. The cook moves to the largest crock first, the one that holds the dried peas. She sets the lamp on a projecting stone and loosens the linen cover, the fabric stiff and cold under her fingers. The smell that rises from the open crock is a dry, dusty, slightly sweet scent, the smell of old fields and some stored for months in these little round seeds. The peas are a pale greenish-grey color, each one shriveled and hard, rattling softly as she scoops a portion into a coarse linen bag that she draws from a pocket of her apron. The bag is already marked with old stains in the softness of many washings, and she pours the peas carefully, letting them trickle through her fingers in a slow stream that clicks and rustles. The quantity is not measured by any written recipe, but by a judgment formed through many Lents, an instinctive sense of how much will swell and soften to feed the community through the day. When the bag is sufficiently heavy, she ties its neck with a piece of twine and sets it aside on the cleanest part of the earthen floor. Next to the peas stands a similar crock for broad beans, these ones larger and flatter than the peas, with a pale buff color and a distinct dark line along each edge. She uncovers this crock as well, and again the scent of the stored legumes rises up, a little earthier than the peas, with a faint undertone of dried clay. The beans are also hard, like little pebbles, and they clatter as she gathers a generous handful after handful into another linen bag. You observe how her hands move with the same unhurried rhythm that defines all her actions, never fumbling, never dropping a single bean, as if the task itself is a form of quiet meditation. She reties the linen cover securely, smoothing it flat over the crock's rim, and then she adds the bag of beans to the growing collection at her feet. From the next shelf, she takes down a smaller stoneware pot with a wooden stopper. This contains the precious salt, brought from distant coastal pans many miles to the east, carried by cart and pack horse through the winter roads. Salt is not used in abundance during Lent, but a little is necessary to draw out the flavors of the vegetables and to keep the body strong. She unstoppers the pot and uses a small horn spoon to transfer a modest amount into a tiny clay jar, just enough for the day's pottage and perhaps a pinch for tomorrow. The salt is a greyish-white, coarsely ground, so that the individual crystals catch the lamplight like tiny chips of sea ice. She works with deliberate care, not spilling a grain, and when the jar is filled, she presses the cork firmly into its neck before placing it with the bags. Now she moves along the wall to where a series of clay pots and small barrels are arranged on a lower shelf. One of these holds verjuice, the tart liquid pressed from unripe grapes or crab apples, used to give a slight sharpness to the pottage in the absence of wine or richer seasonings. The pot is sealed with a waxed cloth, and as she lifts the edge, you catch a whiff of something sharp, clean, and faintly fruity, like the memory of an orchard in September. She pours a small measure into a stoppered earthenware bottle, enough to brighten the broth without overwhelming its plain character. Another pot contains dried wild herbs, rosemary, sage, winter savory, all gathered the previous summer from the Priory garden and hung to dry in bunches from the rafters. The cook selects a small bundle of each, the leaves brittle and curled, their oils concentrated into a heady fragrance that clings to her fingers. She ties them together with a bit of twine and places them in a shallow basket she has brought from the kitchen. A simple woven willow vessel with a handle worn dark. The rafters of the undercroft are hung with more than herbs. You notice plaited ropes of onions, their papery outer skins rustling quietly as the faint draught stirs them, and similar ropes of garlic with their bulbous cloves tightly wrapped in white tissue. She reaches up and unloops one small braid of onions, then a smaller one of garlic, placing them gently in the basket so their skins will not break and scatter. The garlic gives off its familiar, pungent aroma, a smell that seems to wake something ancient in the senses, even here in the dark. The basket begins to fill with the slow accumulation of humble gifts. The onions nestle beside the herb bundles, the garlic resting against the side, all of it speaking of a cuisine stripped to its essentials by the disciplines of the season. Against the eastern wall there is a stack of coarse sacks, each one labelled with a simple stitched mark to indicate its contents. The tallest sack holds barley meal, ground from the Priory's own small harvest, and milled at the water mill downstream. The cook loosens the drawstring and dips her hand into the meal, letting the fine, gritty powder run through her fingers. It is a soft grey-brown flecked with darker specks of bran, and it smells faintly of toasted grain and sun-warmed hay. She scoops a generous amount into a clean linen bag, tying it off with a particular knot that she will recognize later by touch, even without the lamp. Beside the barley meal lie smaller sacks of dried lentils and perhaps a little rye flour, but these she does not touch. They are for other days, other meals. There is a quiet discipline in taking only what is needed, in leaving the rest undisturbed. On the floor beside the sacks, a row of wicker baskets contains the root vegetables that have been stored through the winter months. The cook kneels down, the lamp placed on the ground beside her, and inspects each basket in turn. The first holds parsnips, long and tapering, their pale ivory skins covered in the fine dry sand that has kept them fresh. She takes 3 or 4, selecting those that are still firm and free from blemish, brushing away the sand with a gentle flick of her thumb. The next basket contains turnips, purple-crowned and creamy-bodied, slightly smaller than the parsnips, but just as heavy with stored moisture. She adds a few of these to the pile, lifting each one to feel its weight, to ensure that the flesh inside is still crisp and white. The last basket is filled with winter carrots, smaller and more gnarled than the summer variety, their orange color a deep, almost rusty shade. They have been kept in the same dry sand, and the cook takes a bunch of them, their leafy tops long since trimmed away to preserve the roots. All of these vegetables are carried to the growing collection at the foot of the steps, each movement a slow, purposeful transition from dark storage to the light of the kitchen above. The cook straightens up and stretches her back just slightly, a tiny movement that acknowledges the weight of the morning without any expression of complaint. She gathers the bags in the basket, distributing the weight so that she can carry everything in one trip. The lamp is hooked onto a loop on the basket's handle, and she begins to climb the worn steps back toward the kitchen. The ascent is slow, each foot placed carefully to avoid catching the hem of her habit, and the lamp sways in a gentle arc that makes the shadows dance and swirl. The cold of the undercroft recedes step by step, replaced by the growing warmth of the kitchen and the low sound of the fire, which has settled into a steady, murmuring burn. As she emerges through the low door, the grey morning light from the window slit, strengthened now into a cool, silvery glow, mingles with the golden flame of the lamp to create a soft, unchanging illumination across the scrubbed oak table. She sets the basket and the bags on the table, untying each one and arranging the contents with the same quiet order she displayed below. The dried peas and broad beans are poured into two separate wooden bowls, where they will wait to be rinsed. The root vegetables are placed on a clean cloth, their sand and soil already brushed away, but still carrying the faint, cool smell of the undercroft earth. The onions and garlic sit near the chopping board, and the herbs rest in their bundle at the far end of the table. The salt jar, the verjuice bottle, and the barley meal are all set out, a small array of simple ingredients that together represent the entire, unadorned palette of Lenten cooking. There is nothing here that is rich or extravagant, nothing that comes from an animal, nothing that will spoil or cloy. Each item speaks of the land, of careful storage, of the patience required to wait through the winter for the first signs of spring that are still many weeks away. The cook unties her apron strings briefly, shakes out the dust, and reties them with a smooth, habitual motion. She then moves to the hearth to add a small split log to the fire, the wood catching almost at once with a sudden bright flare that lights up the underside of her chin and the edges of her coif. The great cauldron now sends up a steady plume of steam, and the water inside has begun its gentle simmer, the surface trembling with tiny bubbles that break and reform in a slow, hypnotic dance. The vegetables she added earlier, the onion and the turnip, have softened slightly and now float and sink in a lazy rhythm, their shapes blurred by the shimmer of the hot water. The smell from the pot has deepened, losing its raw edge and taking on the first notes of a cooked broth, a purely vegetable sweetness that mingles with the smoke of the fire and the cool air from the window. She returns to the table and picks up the bowl of dried peas, carrying it to a smaller basin of clean water she has reserved for rinsing. The peas are poured in with a soft rattle, and she swirls them gently with her hand, the water turning faintly cloudy as the last dust of the storage crock is washed away. She drains them carefully into a coarse strainer of woven willow, the water pattering into a bucket below, and then she does the same with the broad beans, her fingers moving through them like a slow rake. The rinsed legumes now glisten darkly, the peas having turned a deeper olive hue and the beans looking almost creamy in the morning light. They will go into the pot soon, but not yet. The cook has a sense of timing that is not hurried, knowing that the base of onion and root must first give its full essence to the water before the legumes are introduced. She now turns her attention to the root vegetables on the cloth, taking up her worn knife once more. The parsnips are the first to be prepared. She trims the tops and the thin, whiskery root ends, then scrapes the skin lightly with the back of the knife, not peeling entirely, but just removing the outermost layer, which is sometimes a little fibrous from the long storage. The pale flesh beneath is uncovered, smooth and dense, giving off a faint, sweet aroma that seems almost floral compared to the earthier turnips. She cuts each parsnip into thick coins, the knife making a crisp sound as it slices through, and these coins are added to a wooden trencher. The turnips follow, their purple skins pared away to reveal a creamy white interior that is crisp and moist. The carrot is last, its rusty orange surface brightening the board, and she cuts these into long, uneven batons that will hold their shape through the long simmering. All of the prepared root pieces are now gathered into a large wooden bowl, their colors pale and restrained, a mosaic of ivory, cream, and dull orange. The bowl is set near the hearth, ready to be added when the moment is right. The cook pauses to wipe the knife clean with a damp cloth, to wash her hands in a little of the cold well water from the bucket, and to look around the kitchen as if confirming that all is in its proper place. Her eyes rest on the basket still holding the small braid of onions and garlic, and she decides to add one more onion to the pot, a small one, to deepen the subtle sweetness of the broth. She loosens it from the plate, the papery skin crackling softly, and peels it at the table. The same slow, methodical movements, the same small pile of translucent skin accumulating at her elbow. The onion is chopped into rough pieces, not finely, for this is a rustic dish that does not require precision, and the pieces are tipped into the cauldron where they disappear beneath the steaming surface with a soft, deep plop that sends a tiny plume of steam curling upward. Now the kitchen holds a profound, suspended quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when all the materials are assembled and the long, slow transformation of cooking is about to enter its central phase. The fire crackles, the water simmers, the steam rises, and the cook stands for a moment with her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her breathing slow and even. Through the window slit, the grey sky has not changed, but the light is stronger now, revealing the dust that floats in slow spirals through the air. The scent in the kitchen has become a complex, gentle thing, layers of onion and root and water and wood smoke, none of them shouting, all of them blending into a single, peaceful atmosphere. The undercroft, back in its darkness, returns to its silent watch over the remaining stores, the crocks and sacks and baskets waiting patiently for the next visit, the next day, the next Lenten season. Everything in this priory moves in cycles, in gentle repetitions, in a quiet rhythm that has no need for haste or novelty. And the cook, as she lifts the bowl of rinsed legumes and carries it toward the hearth, the simply amise and carries it toward the hearth, is simply part of that rhythm, as steady and unremarkable as the turning of the earth. The great cauldron now holds only water, the cold, clear well water that the cook carried bucket by bucket across the cloister in the grey half-light before prime. It sits in the iron vessel with a stillness that seems almost solid, a dark circular mirror that reflects the shifting flames of the hearth and the shadow of the cook's moving form whenever she passes near. The surface is smooth and unbroken except where the rising warmth begins to create the faintest of tremors, a shiver that is not yet a bubble, but a suggestion of the heat that is slowly, patiently working its way through the mass of cold liquid. The water came from deep within the chalk, drawn through the well's ancient stone lining, and even now it retains something of that underground coldness, a mineral silence that speaks of layers of rock and time. You can smell it, a clean, hard, slightly sharp scent, like the air after rain on a limestone path, and it mingles with the wood smoke and the first earthy fragrance of the vegetables that wait on the table. The cook stands beside the table where the root vegetables are laid out on a clean, damp cloth. Her sleeves are still pushed up above her elbows, the cord tied firmly, and her apron is smoothed flat over her habit. The light from the window slit has grown strong enough to cast a pale, silvery illumination across the table, catching the edges of the turnips and parsnips and carrots so that they seem almost to glow with their own inner store of muted color. The turnips are the first she takes up, a pair of them, each one slightly flattened at the top where the purple crown gives way to creamy white. Their bodies round and solid in her hand. She holds one under the cold water she has poured into a small wooden basin, rubbing the skin with her thumb in slow circles to loosen any remaining grains of the sand in which they were stored. The water in the basin clouds faintly, the sand sinking in a tiny swirl to the bottom, and she lifts the turnip dripping, its skin now shiny and clean, the purple and white more vivid than before. She sets it on a wooden board, then takes up the worn knife with the smooth handle, a tool so familiar to her hand that it seems an extension of her fingers. The blade is notched from long use, but it is sharp, and she trims the top where the old leaf stalks have shriveled to dry brown stubs, then pares away a thin strip of the fibrous root end, leaving a neat, flat base. The motion is unhurried, each cut a small, precise action, as if every turnip in the Priory store deserves its own moment of attention. After trimming, she begins to peel the turnip, but only lightly, because much of the goodness lies just beneath the skin, and the Lenten rule is to waste nothing that can nourish. The knife scrapes with a soft, sandy sound, removing the thinnest possible layer of the purple and white exterior, which curls away in short, damp ribbons that fall onto the cloth. The flesh that is revealed is a pale ivory color, crisp and dense, with a faintly peppery smell that tickles the nose when you lean close. When the first turnip is fully peeled, she cuts it in half from top to root, and then each half is sliced into thick, even wedges that will hold their shape through the long simmering. The wedges are placed into a wooden bowl that already contains a little water to keep them from browning, and she begins the same process with the second turnip, the knife never faltering, the rhythm as steady as the ticking of a water clock that does not exist in this priory, where time is marked only by bells and the slow progress of the sun behind the clouds. Beside the turnips, the parsnips lie waiting. They are longer and more slender, tapering from a broad shoulder to a thin, whiskery point. Their skins are pale, earthy ivory that is almost the same color as the flesh within. The cook takes the first parsnip and washes it in the same basin, the water swirling around its length, and she uses a stiff brush made of bound twigs to scrub away the stubborn sand that clings to the little rootlets along its sides. The brush makes a soft, rhythmic, shushing sound, and the sand releases in tiny clouds that drift down through the water. Once it is clean, she lays it on the board and cuts away the top and the very tip, then splits it lengthwise so the two halves lie flat. The core of the parsnip is sometimes a little woody in the older roots, and she checks this one by pressing the point of the knife into the center. It slides in easily, so the core is tender, and she is satisfied. She cuts the halves into long, thick batons. Their cut surface is pale and moist, giving off a scent that is sweet and almost nutty, reminiscent of cold earth and sun-warmed hay. These batons are added to the wooden bowl, sliding in beside the turnip wedges with a soft, wet click. The carrots are the last of the root vegetables. The winter carrots that have been stored in sand and have grown more gnarled and twisted than their summer cousins. Their color is a deep rusty orange, and some of them have small cracks or forked roots that make them look like little wooden figures from a forgotten fable. The cook selects 3 of medium size, washes them with the same care, brushing the sand from every crevice, and then she trims the tops and tails. She does not peel them completely, but scrapes the skin lightly with the back of the knife, just enough to remove the thin, papery outer layer and any small eyes or blemishes. The orange color intensifies where the skin is scraped away, and the carrot gives off its distinctive, slightly sweet, earthy perfume. She cuts each carrot into thick rounds, the knife making a crisp, satisfying crunch with every slice, and these rounds are the last to go into the wooden bowl, where they lie among the other vegetables like small orange coins in a treasury of pale ivory and cream. Now all the root vegetables are prepared and waiting, their cut surfaces glistening faintly in the cool air, their scents mingling together into a single gentle aroma that hovers around the table. The cook rinses her hands in the basin, drying them on the corner of her apron, and then she lifts the wooden bowl, cradling it in both hands as if it contains something precious. She walks the few steps to the hearth, where the great cauldron hangs over the fire, the water inside now showing the first tiny silvery bubbles that cling to the iron walls and rise in slow, wobbling columns to the surface. The steam is heavier than before, a soft, warm cloud that wets her face slightly as she leans forward, and she tips the bowl carefully, letting the vegetables slide from the rim into the pot. They enter the water with a series of soft, deep plops, the turnip wedges going first, then the parsnip batons falling end over end, then the carrot rounds scattering across the surface before they all settle and slowly sink beneath the gently trembling water. The surface of the cauldron is momentarily disturbed, the ripples spreading outward in expanding circles that meet the iron sides and reflect back, growing fainter and fainter until the water is still again, hiding its new contents below. The cook does not stir immediately. She waits, watching the water with the patience of someone who knows that the beginning of a pottage is not a time for action, but for waiting. The vegetables need to feel the heat to begin their slow surrender to the warming liquid before any stirring is required. She places the empty wooden bowl back on the table and then returns to the hearth, where she now takes up the small clay jar of salt and the tiny horn spoon. Removing the cork, she dips the spoon into the grayish-white crystals, leveling it with a tap of her finger, and then she holds it over the cauldron, letting the salt fall in a thin, steady stream that hisses very faintly as it meets the hot water. The salt dissolves almost instantly, vanishing into the broth without a trace, but its presence will draw out the subtle sweetness of the roots, the earthiness of the turnips, the nuttiness of the parsnips, the gentle sugar of the carrots. 2 small pinches is all she adds, not more, because the Lenten table is a table of restraint, and the flavor should come from the vegetables themselves, not from the cook's hand. After the salt, she brings the small earthenware bottle of verjuice, the tart liquid she poured in the undercroft. She unstoppers it and sniffs the opening, her nostrils catching the sharp, clean scent that is like the memory of green apples just before they ripen. She tilts the bottle over the cauldron and lets a thin, slow drizzle fall into the pot, the verjuice cutting through the steam and leaving a faintly acidic scent in the air that mingles with the mineral water and the root vegetables. The amount is small, barely enough to notice in the finished pottage, but it will brighten the flavor, giving a slight edge that balances the natural sweetness of the long-cooked vegetables. The cook restoppers the bottle and sets it aside on the stone ledge beside the salt jar, where it will remain for any later adjustment. Now she picks up the long-handled wooden paddle from its resting place on the ledge. The handle is warm from the heat of the hearth, and the blade is smooth and slightly curved from years of scraping the bottom of iron pots. She slides the blade into the water, the motion slow and careful, letting it sink until it touches the bottom of the cauldron with a soft, muffled clunk that you feel more than hear. Then she begins to stir, not vigorously but with a gentle circular motion that moves the water in a lazy spiral. The paddle travels around the cauldron once, twice, 3 times, each rotation slow enough that you can count the seconds between the lift of the blade and its next descent. The vegetables at the bottom shift and resettle, the turnip wedges turning over, the parsnip batons floating up for a moment before sinking again, the carrot rounds wobbling in the current. The stirring is not meant to mix ingredients so much as to ensure that nothing sticks, that the heat is evenly distributed, that the water and the vegetables begin their long, slow conversation without interruption. After a few rotations, she lifts the paddle out, letting the water drip from its blade back into the pot, and she rests it against the stone wall of the fireplace, where it will be close at hand throughout the morning. The kitchen now enters a period of waiting and watching, a quiet interval in which the cook's main task is simply to be present. She draws the low wooden stool closer to the hearth and sits down, her back straight but not stiff, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The heat from the fire touches her face and her bare forearms, and you can see the way the warmth makes her skin glow faintly, a soft, healthy pink that is the only color in the gray and brown of the kitchen. Her eyes rest on the cauldron, but her gaze is not fixed. It is the look of someone whose thoughts have settled into a calm, almost empty state, a watchfulness that does not strain. The fire burns steadily. The flames now are deep, golden orange with occasional flickers of blue at the base where the wood is hottest, and the logs shift with a soft, dull thud as they settle deeper into the bed of embers. The sound of the fire is a low, continuous murmur, punctuated by the occasional sharp crack when a pocket of sap or moisture bursts inside a log, sending a tiny shower of sparks up the chimney that wink out before they reach the open air. The smell from the cauldron is changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the minutes pass. The clean, mineral scent of the well water is receding, being replaced by something warmer and more complex. The onion she added earlier, the one that has been simmering since before the roots went in, is now beginning to soften and release its essence, a sweet, slightly pungent fragrance that rises with the steam and spreads through the kitchen. The raw, peppery note of the turnips has mellowed, blending with the nutty aroma of the parsnips and the earthy sweetness of the carrots. Together they create a scent that is not yet a broth, but is moving in that direction, a promise of the nourishment to come. The steam itself is thicker now, a constant, gentle column that rises from the surface of the water and curls upward toward the high dark rafters, where it mingles with the smoke from the fire and the cold air that seeps in through the window slit. The kitchen is a world of its own, a warm, damp, fragrant cave that seems entirely separate from the cold grey morning outside. Through the window slit, the sky remains a uniform, pale grey, the clouds so thick and still that it is impossible to tell where the sun might be. The light that enters does not cast shadows. It is a diffuse, silvery light that makes everything in the kitchen look soft and slightly blurred, as if the edges of objects are melting into the air. The only sharp outlines are the flames and the hearth, which flicker and dart with a life of their own, and the silhouette of the cook against the glow. She rises from her stool from time to time to add another small piece of wood to the fire, selecting a stick from the pile beside the hearth and laying it carefully on the burning logs, watching for a moment as it catches and begins to burn, then returning to her seat. She also stirs the pot again, the same slow circular motion, the paddle scraping the bottom with a sound like a stone being rolled over wet sand, and each time she lifts some of the vegetables up through the water to check their progress. The turnips have lost their crisp whiteness and are now a translucent pale grey, the parsnips a soft ivory, the carrots still holding their orange but beginning to look more dull as the colour leaches into the surrounding liquid. The water, clear and bright when she poured it, has taken on a faint cloudy tinge, a pale golden green that is the colour of a winter field just after the frost has melted. As the morning goes on, the cook is joined by a single other presence, a small grey cat that belongs to the Priory and lives in the barns in the kitchen, tolerated for its usefulness in keeping away mice. The cat slips through the slightly open door and crosses the stone floor with silent, delicate steps, its tail held high and its green eyes catching the firelight. It does not approach the cauldron, for it has learned to respect the heat, but it finds a spot on the warm stones near the hearth, where a patch of light falls from a crack in the chimney hood. The cat curls up there, tucking its paws under its chest, and closes its eyes, its breathing soon becoming slow and regular. The cook glances at the cat, a flicker of something soft passing over her face, and then she returns her gaze to the pot. The two of them, the woman and the cat, share the hearth in a companionable silence, each absorbed in their own quiet occupation, the one watching the slow transformation of water and roots, the other simply sleeping in the warmth. The bells of the Priory ring again, the sound of tercet drifting from the chapel, and you hear the nuns' voices rising in the next hour of prayer. The chanting is faint and rhythmic, the Latin syllables flowing together into a long, unbroken line that rises and falls like the breath of the Priory itself. The cook listens, her head slightly tilted, and she may be following the words in her mind or simply letting the sound wash over her as she sits. The chanting ends, and a deep silence returns, deeper than before, as if the stone walls have absorbed the prayers and are now holding them in their cool grey memory. The cook stirs the pot once more, adding a little more water from the bucket, because the level has dropped slightly as the steam escapes. The new water is cold and makes the temperature of the cauldron dip for a moment, but the fire soon brings it back, and the gentle simmer resumes, the bubbles now a little larger and more frequent, breaking the surface with soft, liquid pops that release small puffs of fragrant steam. This is the heart of the morning, the long, slow middle stretch in which nothing seems to change, and yet everything is changing. The water and the vegetables and the heat working together in a process that cannot be rushed. The cook knows this, and she does not try to hurry. She simply remains, watching the fire, stirring the pot, listening to the silence, her whole being attuned to the gentle rhythm of the kitchen. The vegetables that were once hard and raw are now becoming tender, their fibers loosening, their starches beginning to dissolve into the broth. The water that was cold and clear is now warm and coloured, carrying the essence of the earth in every drop. The fire that was newly lit is now a steady bed of coals, glowing with a deep, constant heat. And the cook who began the day in the darkness before dawn is now in the middle of her long, slow work, as steady and patient as the stones of the Priory floor, as calm and quiet as the cat sleeping at her feet. The cook rises from her stool, the movement so gradual that it seems a continuation of her sitting rather than a departure from it. She crosses the short distance to the table where the two wooden bowls of rinsed legumes have been waiting. The peas and the broad beans glistening darkly in the cool air, their skins shiny from the washing and still carrying a faint trace of the undercroft's earthy chill. The kitchen around her is quiet, except for the steady murmur of the fire and the soft, liquid simmer of the cauldron, which has now been warming the root vegetables for long enough that the broth has taken on a pale golden-green hue and gives off a scent that is sweet and clean and faintly sharp from the verjuice. The cook picks up the first bowl, the one containing the dried peas, and holds it in the crook of her arm as she walks back to the hearth, the peas rattling softly against the wood with each step, a sound like rain on a distant roof. The peas have changed during their overnight soaking and their morning rinse. They are no longer the shriveled, grey-green pellets that came from the storage crock, but have swollen to almost twice their former size, their skins now smooth and slightly loose, their colour deepened to a soft, muted olive. They lie in the bowl in a damp, heavy mass, and when the cook tilts the bowl slightly, they slide against one another with a wet, whispering friction. She stands beside the cauldron, the steam warm against her face and the front of her apron, and she begins to add the peas to the pot. She does not dump them in all at once, but lets them fall from the bowl in a slow, controlled stream, her free hand guiding the flow so they scatter evenly across the surface of the simmering broth. The peas hit the water with a soft, collective hiss, like a small sigh, and they sink immediately, disappearing beneath the surface in a swirl of tiny bubbles. The broth closes over them without fuss, accepting them into its warm, working depths, and the cook uses the long-handled wooden paddle to give the pot a single, slow stir, just enough to settle the peas among the turnip wedges and parsnip batons and carrot rounds that are already softening at the bottom. The broad beans come next. She exchanges the now empty pea bowl for the second bowl on the table, this one holding the beans, and she carries it back to the hearth with the same calm, unhurried steps. The beans are larger than the peas, flat and oval, each one marked along its edge with a dark line that stands out against the pale, creamy buff of the skin. They too have swollen in their soaking, becoming plump and tender-looking, their skins beginning to wrinkle just slightly as the inner starch absorbs the water. They feel heavy in the bowl, and when the cook tilts it, the beans tumble forward with a sound like small pebbles rolling over one another, though softer, muted by the moisture they carry. She empties the bowl into the cauldron with the same controlled, gradual motion, the beans entering the broth in a series of soft plops that send up tiny droplets of golden liquid onto the rim of the iron. The beans spread out as they sink, some of them resting on top of the root vegetables, others sliding down the sides of the cauldron to find their own places in the simmering depths. The surface of the pottage is now more crowded, the vegetables and legumes all visible in the dim, bubbling liquid, their shapes blurring and shifting as the gentle current moves them. With both legumes added, the cook now takes up the paddle in earnest. She slides it into the cauldron, the blade cutting through the broth with a soft, liquid resistance, and she begins to stir in the same slow, circular motion she has used all morning. The paddle moves around the perimeter of the pot, then across the center, then around again, tracing a path that is both methodical and gentle, designed not to break the softening vegetables, but to ensure that the peas and beans are distributed evenly, that no single spot on the bottom of the cauldron holds a dense clump of legumes that might stick or burn. The sound of the stirring is a low, liquid whisper, the blade scraping the iron just enough to make a soft, rhythmic shush that joins the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the broth. The cook stirs for a long time, her arm moving in the same steady, unhurried rhythm, her eyes watching the surface of the pottage as it swirls and resettles. The steam rises around her in a thick, warm cloud that makes the edges of her coif curl slightly, and you can see the tiny beads of moisture that form on the wool of her habit where the steam touches it. The color of the broth begins to change almost immediately after the legumes enter. The clear, pale, golden-green liquid that was the essence of onion and root vegetable now starts to turn cloudy, a soft, milky haziness spreading through the pot as the starches from the peas and beans begin to release into the hot water. This cloudiness is the first sign that the pottage is beginning its transformation from a simple vegetable broth into something thicker, more substantial, something that will cling to a wooden spoon and warm the stomach through the long, cold afternoon. The cook watches this change with the quiet attention of someone who has seen it happen hundreds of times before, who knows the exact moment when the broth begins to thicken and the exact shade of grey-green that signals the halfway point of the cooking. She stirs again, the paddle now meeting slightly more resistance, the liquid no longer as thin and water-like as a few minutes before, and she nods almost imperceptibly, satisfied that the process is unfolding as it should. The fire beneath the cauldron has settled into a deep bed of glowing coals, the logs having burned down to their red and orange hearts, and the cook turns to the woodpile to select a fresh split log. She chooses one that is not too large, for the heat must remain steady but not fierce. A pottage does not want a rolling boil, which would break the vegetables apart and turn the broth into a muddy, unappetizing slurry. She lays the new log on top of the coals, and after a moment the flames lick up around it, pale and wavering at first, then stronger and more golden as the dry wood catches. The new heat sends a fresh surge of warmth through the kitchen, and the bubbling of the cauldron grows slightly more lively, the lazy bubbles now rising in a more constant stream, each one carrying a tiny bit of the cloudiness upward before it breaks on the surface and releases a puff of fragrant steam. The smell from the pot has deepened further now, the sweet, sharp notes of the onion and verjuice being joined by a rich, earthy, almost creamy scent that comes from the cooking legumes. It is a smell that speaks of sustenance, of fields and soil and the slow, patient work of growing and harvesting and storing, now all concentrated into this single iron vessel hanging over the fire. The cook stirs again, the paddle moving slowly through the thickening broth, and you notice the way the vegetables and legumes have begun to soften in earnest. A turnip wedge, when it surfaces briefly in the current of the stirring, is no longer the crisp white piece it was when it entered the pot. It is now a translucent pale grey, its edges beginning to blur and round as the fibers break down. A parsnip baton floats up and then sinks again, its surface soft and slightly dimpled, its color now a muted ivory that is almost indistinguishable from the broth itself. The carrot rounds still hold their shape and their orange color, but they too have grown tender, and one of them splits in half as the paddle passes through it, the two halves drifting apart in a slow, silent separation. The peas have swelled even further in the hot liquid, their skins now splitting on some to reveal the soft, mealy interior, and the broad beans have grown plump and tender, their dark edges becoming less distinct as they cook and soften. The pottage is no longer a collection of separate ingredients, but is becoming a single, unified substance, each element contributing its own essence to the whole, while still retaining enough of its identity to give the eater something to chew. A thin skin begins to form on the surface of the pottage during the moments when the cook is not stirring. It is a translucent, slightly wrinkled film that spreads from the edges of the cauldron inward, a natural consequence of the starches rising to the top and meeting the cooler air. The cook notices it and breaks it with a gentle pass of the paddle, folding it back into the broth where it dissolves without a trace. This skin will form again and again throughout the long cooking, and each time she will break it, a small repetitive gesture that is so habitual she likely does not think about it at all. The paddle rises and falls, the skin breaks and reforms, the fire crackles and glows, and the whole kitchen settles into a rhythm that feels as ancient and unchanging as the hills beyond the Priory walls. The cat at the hearth stirs in its sleep, stretches one paw out into the warm air, and then curls up again, its grey fur rising and falling with each slow breath. The cook glances at the animal and then at the window slit, where the grey light remains as steady and unchanging as it has been all morning, the clouds so thick that it is impossible to tell whether the sun is climbing toward noon or standing still. She returns to her stool and sits down, the paddle resting across her knees for a moment, while she wipes her forehead with the back of her hand, the warmth of the kitchen having drawn a faint sheen of moisture to her skin. Then she is still, her hands folded once more, her breathing slow and even, her whole body relaxed into the patient watchfulness that is the cook's true work during the long middle hours of the day. The sounds of the Priory continue in their familiar, muted way, drifting through the stone walls, as if from a great distance even when they are close. A nun walks past the kitchen door, her footsteps soft and regular on the flagstones of the cloister walk, and you hear the faint rustle of her habit and the click of her wooden pattens before the sound fades toward the chapel. Two doves coo to each other from the shelter of the cloister garth, their soft, bubbling voices a gentle counterpoint to the deeper murmur of the fire. The bell for sext will ring soon, marking the middle of the day, but for now there is only the quiet, the warmth, the steady, slow transformation of water and vegetables and legumes into something that will feed the sisters when they gather for their midday meal. The cook sits in the center of it all, not moving, not thinking in any way that could be called active thought, simply existing in the same calm, unhurried way that the cauldron simmers and the fire burns, and the grey light falls through the window onto the worn stones of the floor. The legumes have entered the broth, and now they must cook, and there is nothing in the world that can make them cook faster or slower than they are doing. No urgency that can be applied, no shortcut that can be taken. All that is required is time and heat and the patient, watchful presence of the cook, and all of these are here in abundance. The cook sets the paddle aside on the stone ledge, wiping her hands slowly down the front of her apron, and then she turns toward the small door that leads out to the cloister walk. The kitchen behind her continues its quiet, steady life. The fire murmurs, the cauldron bubbles, the grey cat remains curled and sleeping. She pushes the door open, and a gust of cold, fresh air meets her face, so different from the warm, steamy atmosphere of the kitchen that it feels like stepping into a different element entirely. The door closes behind her with its familiar soft clunk, and she is now outside, in the covered walkway that runs around the cloister garth, the stone flags underfoot, still holding the chill of the night, despite the slow advance of the morning. The light here is the same pale silvery grey that fills the kitchen window, but outside it feels more present, more enveloping, coming from all directions at once. The air smells of damp stone, wet earth, and the faint, clean scent of the frost that is only now beginning to melt from the grass in the central courtyard. The cook walks along the cloister walk, her wooden patterns making their soft, rhythmic sound, past the entrance to the chapel, past the silent scriptorium, until she reaches a small low archway at the southern corner of the Priory. This archway leads out of the cloister proper and into the kitchen garden, a small plot of ground that is sheltered on two sides by the high stone walls of the Priory buildings and on a third side by a thick hedge of hawthorn, bare now but still dense enough to break the wind. The garden faces south, catching whatever thin sunlight the season offers, and its soil is dark and well turned, carefully tended even in these lean weeks of early Lent. The cook pauses at the entrance, looking over the garden with the quiet appraisal of someone who knows every inch of this ground, every plant that grows here, every herb that has survived the winter and is now beginning to stir again. The garden is modest, no more than a few paces wide and a few paces long. Its beds are raised slightly, edged with stones gathered from the Priory's own fields, and a narrow path of packed gravel runs between them, now damp and dark with the melting frost. Most of the beds are bare, their soil turned over and waiting for the spring planting that will come after Easter. But in the bed closest to the south-facing wall, the one that catches the most warmth, there are still living plants. The cook walks toward it, her steps careful on the gravel path, and she kneels down on a flat stone that has been placed there for this very purpose. The stone is cold through the wool of her habit, but she does not seem to notice. Her attention is entirely on the plants before her. The rosemary is the largest of them, a woody shrub that has been growing here for several years, its stems gnarled and thick at the base, branching out into slender, upright shoots that are covered in needle-like leaves. The leaves are a dark, dusty green on top, slightly curled at the edges, and a pale silvery grey underneath, and as the cook reaches out to touch them, they release their familiar, sharp, resinous fragrance into the cold air. The scent of rosemary is one that clings, that stays on the fingers and in the memory, a smell of warm hillsides and sun-baked earth, so different from the cool, damp English spring that it seems like a gift from a distant land. She selects a few of the younger sprigs, those that are still green and pliable rather than woody and dry, and she snips them with her worn knife, the blade making a small, clean sound as it cuts through the stems. The sprigs lie in her palm, their leaves trembling slightly in the cold breeze, their scent intensifying with every movement. Beside the rosemary grows the sage, a lower, bushier plant that has kept more of itself alive through the winter. The sage leaves are broad and oval, their texture soft and faintly fuzzy, like the ears of a lamb, and their color is a soft grey-green that blends into the stones of the wall behind them. The cook bends down to inspect them, lifting one leaf gently between her finger and thumb, and she finds that the new growth at the tips is already beginning to show, small pale leaves that are tender and full of moisture. She chooses 3 or 4 of the older leaves, the ones that are fully grown and deep in color but still supple, and she snips those as well, adding them to the small bundle in her hand. The sage gives off its own distinctive scent, a warm, earthy, slightly peppery aroma that mingles with the rosemary to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts, a complex herbal perfume that seems to hang in the still air of the garden. Further along the bed, in a small clump near the corner where the south wall meets the hawthorn hedge, grows the winter's savory. This is a smaller, more modest plant, its stems low to the ground and its leaves tiny and dark, almost the color of old bronze. Winter savory is hardy, able to withstand the frosts and the cold winds without complaint, and its flavor is robust and slightly bitter, a perfect addition to a Lenten pottage that needs depth without richness. The cook pinches a few of the small glossy leaves, and they release a sharp, clean, almost peppery scent that clears the head and wakes the senses. She adds these to her bundle, the tiny leaves nestling among the larger rosemary sprigs and the soft sage, a gathering of 3 distinct herbs that together will bring a quiet, aromatic complexity to the simmering broth. With the herbs in her hand, the cook rises from her kneeling position, her knees making a soft, muffled popping sound that is the only complaint her body ever offers. She stands for a moment looking out over the garden, perhaps noting where the new parsley will be sown, where the cabbages will go, where the onion sets will be pressed into the warming soil when the season finally turns. Then she turns and walks back along the gravel path, through the low archway and into the cloister walk. The chill of the outdoor air has made her cheeks flush slightly pink, and her fingers are cold where they hold the damp, fragrant herbs, but she does not hurry. She walks at the same measured pace, her pattens clicking softly, and when she reaches the kitchen door she pushes it open and steps back into the warmth. The kitchen envelops her again. The steam, the smoke, the gentle sound of the bubbling pottage, all unchanged. The cat lifts its head briefly, recognizes her, and settles back into sleep. The cook crosses to the table where she lays the herbs out on the clean, damp cloth, spreading them so she can see each one. The rosemary sprigs are slender and elegant, their needle leaves dark and fragrant. The sage leaves are broad and soft, their grey-green colour muted in the kitchen light. The winter savoury stems are delicate, their tiny leaves almost black against the pale wood of the table. She takes a moment to remove any leaves that are yellowed or damaged, pinching them off with her thumbnail and dropping them into a small bucket of scraps that will be taken to the Priory's compost heap behind the barn. What remains is perfect, a small collection of hardy aromatic greens, each one carrying the essence of the garden, the soil, the cold spring air. Now the cook takes each sprig and leaf, and very gently she bruises them between her finger and thumb. This is not a violent action, but a soft, deliberate pressing, a rolling of the stems and leaves that releases the oils trapped within the plant fibers. As she works, the scents intensify dramatically, the rosemary becoming almost piney and sharp, the sage warming into something richer and more musky, the winter savory turning peppery and clean. Her fingers become coated with the fragrant oils, and the whole kitchen seems to fill with the concentrated aroma of the herbs, a scent so vivid that it cuts through the heavier smell of cooking legumes and root vegetables, like a beam of light through cloud. It is a sober, clean, medicinal fragrance, the kind of smell that speaks of healing and calmness, of old knowledge passed down through generations of cooks and herbalists. When all the herbs have been bruised, she gathers them into a neat bundle, aligning the stems so they lie together, and she takes a piece of clean twine from a small stone jar on the table. The twine is made of hemp, rough and slightly hairy, and she winds it around the bundle several times, pulling it tight and tying it with a simple knot that she secures with a quick, precise tug. The bundle is now a small, compact bouquet, the herbs bound together so they can simmer in the pottage without scattering, their flavors infusing the broth slowly and evenly. She trims the ends of the twine with her knife and then holds the bundle up, inspecting it, turning it in the light. It is a modest thing, this little bundle of herbs, but it represents a great deal. The garden's patient endurance through the winter, the cook's knowledge of flavor and balance, the Priory's commitment to using what the earth provides rather than what the purse could buy. She carries the herb bundle to the cauldron and lowers it carefully into the simmering pottage, the twine trailing from her fingers until the last moment, when she releases it and lets the bundle sink. It disappears beneath the surface, then bobs up again briefly, the leaves spreading out slightly in the hot liquid before the weight of the stems pulls it back down. The cook uses the paddle to push it gently toward the center of the pot, where the heat is most even, and then she stirs once, twice, in that same slow circular motion, the paddle weaving around the herb bundle, as if welcoming it into the dance of the simmering ingredients. The steam that rises carries a new note now, a faint, aromatic sharpness, and the cook inhales it with a quiet satisfaction, her nostrils flaring slightly, her eyes half closing as she registers the change. She steps back from the cauldron and goes to the small shelf where the salt jar sits. This jar is a simple stoneware pot with a fitted wooden lid, and it holds the precious grey-white salt that was brought from the coastal pans. She removes the lid and takes out the tiny horn spoon, dipping it into the crystals, leveling it carefully. This is the second time she has salted the pottage today, and this addition will be the final one. A modest pinch that will draw together all the flavors, the sweetness of the roots, the earthiness of the legumes, the aromatic notes of the herbs. She holds the spoon over the cauldron, letting the salt fall in a thin, steady trickle, the crystals catching the light for a moment before they vanish into the broth. The sound is a faint hiss, barely audible over the simmering, but it marks a quiet completion, the moment when the pottage becomes whole. Beside the salt jar, there is a tiny clay dish containing a few dried grains of wild peppercress, a plant that grows along the edges of the Priory's fields and has been gathered in summer and dried for use through the winter. Peppercress is not true pepper, which is far too costly for a modest Priory, but it has a similar sharp, pungent heat. The cook takes 2 or 3 of the dried grains between her finger and thumb, holding them over the pot, and she rubs them together, crushing them into a rough powder that drifts down onto the surface of the broth. The tiny flecks of crushed peppercress spread out and then disappear, leaving behind only their faint, warming scent, a tickle of heat at the back of the nose. This small addition will provide a subtle background warmth to the pottage, not enough to make it spicy, but enough to give it a gentle liveliness, a quiet spark that will be felt rather than tasted. Now the cook returns to a stool, sitting down with the paddle across her knees, and she waits while the herbs begin their work. The transformation of the scent is not sudden, it is a slow, gradual unfolding, like a flower opening over the course of an hour. At first, the broth smells much as it did before, dominated by the sweet, earthy notes of the root vegetables and the creamy beany scent of the cooking legumes. Then, very slowly, the herbal notes begin to emerge, the rosemary first, its sharp, piney fragrance cutting through the heavier scents like a clear, high note in a low chant. After the rosemary comes the sage, its warm, musky, slightly bitter aroma adding depth and softness, rounding out the sharpness of the rosemary and blending it with the sweetness of the carrots. Last comes the winter savory, its peppery, clean scent lifting the whole, giving it a freshness that belies the long, slow cooking. Together, the three herbs create a fragrance that is complex but not overwhelming, aromatic but not perfumed, a scent that is entirely appropriate for a Lenten meal, sober, restrained, and yet deeply satisfying. The cook sits and breathes this changing air, her body still, her mind quiet. The steam that rises from the cauldron is now something you could almost taste, a savory, herbal vapor that coats the tongue when you inhale deeply. It is a clean taste, a taste of the garden and the wild field edges, of old stone walls and sun-warmed earth, of the patient care that has gone into every step of this day's work. The kitchen itself seems to have changed, its atmosphere now infused with the subtle, medicinal quality that makes the air feel purer, more wholesome, as if the herbs are doing their quiet work not only in the pot, but in the room itself. The grey cat stirs and stretches, perhaps reacting to the new scent, and then settles again, its nose twitching once before it returns to sleep. The cook lifts the paddle and stirs the pottage again, the motion slow and regular, the paddle moving through the thickened broth with a soft, liquid sound. The herb bundle surfaces briefly, its leaves now darker and more wilted, their color leached into the surrounding liquid, and then it sinks again as the paddle passes over it. The cook checks the consistency of the pottage, noting how the wooden blade meets more resistance than before, how the broth now clings to the paddle rather than running off in thin streams, and she is satisfied that the legumes are breaking down as they should, their starches continuing to thicken the whole. She adds a little more water from the bucket, just a splash, because the long simmering has reduced the level again, and the new water hisses softly as it meets the hot surface, then is folded in by another slow, circular stir. The morning has moved into its later hours now, the grey light through the window still steady, but perhaps a shade brighter, the clouds thinning just enough to let a little more illumination into the kitchen. The cook looks up at the window, her face calm and expressionless, and then she returns her gaze to the pot. The herbs have now been simmering for long enough that their work is mostly done, the oils have been released, the flavors have been transferred, and what remains in the bundle is mostly spent, the leaves limp and colorless. But she will leave them in the pot until the meal is served, because even the spent herbs can give a little more, and nothing is wasted in the Priory kitchen. The rosemary, the sage, the winter savory, these humble plants that survive the winter in the shelter of the south wall, have given all they have to the pottage, and their quiet gift will soon be shared among the sisters, sustaining them through the rest of the Lenten day. The cook remains seated on her low wooden stool beside the hearth, the long-handled paddle resting across her knees when she is not actively stirring, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The kitchen around her has settled into the deep, steady rhythm of the middle day, a rhythm that is not measured by any clock, but by the slow pulse of the fire and the gentle, constant simmer of the cauldron. The flames have burned down again to a bed of glowing coals, their color a deep, soft orange that seems to breathe, brightening and dimming in a slow, hypnotic cycle as the air moves through the chimney. The cook watches the coals, her gaze calm and unfocused, her breathing so slow and even that it matches the rise and fall of the fire's glow. She is not asleep, but she is not fully awake, in the way that the world outside the priory walls might understand wakefulness. She is in a state of quiet attention, a watchful rest that allows her to notice every small change in the pottage without needing to think about it. The paddle is lifted, its blade sliding into the broth with a soft, liquid sound, and the stirring resumes. This is the cook's primary task now, the one that will occupy her through the long stretch between terce and sext, and it is a task that requires no great effort but a great deal of patience. The motion is always the same. The paddle enters the pot at the near edge, its blade angled slightly downward. Then it pushes through the thickening broth in a slow arc toward the far side, scraping the bottom of the cauldron with a gentle, muffled scrape that is felt more than heard. At the far side, she lifts the blade just enough to turn it, then draws it back toward herself, the liquid parting and closing behind it with a soft, sucking sound. Then the paddle circles the outer edge of the pot, once, twice, tracing the curve of the iron, and finally it cuts across the center, moving through the densest part of the pottage where the vegetables and legumes have settled. This entire cycle takes perhaps a minute, perhaps a little longer, and when it is complete, she pauses, the paddle resting against the rim, and then after a short interval she begins again. The sound of the stirring is a low, wet murmur, a sound that is so constant and so soft that it becomes a part of the kitchen's background, like the crackle of the fire or the distant coo of the doves. It is a sound that would be easy to ignore, but if you were to close your eyes and simply listen, you would hear the many small variations within it, the slight change in pitch when the paddle moves through a denser clump of peas, the tiny sharp tap when the blade encounters a carrot round, the smooth silken whisper when it passes through the thinnest part of the broth. The cook hears all of these things, not with her conscious mind, but with her body, her hand on the paddle sensing every shift in texture and temperature, and using that information to adjust the stirring, to slow down or speed up, to press a little harder or lift a little higher. It is a conversation without words, a dialogue between the cook and the cauldron that has been going on since the fire was first lit before dawn. As the minutes pass, the sound of the paddle begins to change in a subtle but unmistakable way. The broth is thickening, the starches from the peas and beans continuing to dissolve into the hot water, the fibers of the root vegetables breaking down into a soft, yielding mass. The paddle now meets a gentle resistance, not the resistance of something solid, but the resistance of a liquid that has become heavier, more substantial, a liquid that clings to the blade when it is lifted and drips back into the pot in thick, slow droplets rather than thin, watery streams. The cook notices this change and adjusts her stirring accordingly, making her circles a little wider, her strokes a little slower, ensuring that the thicker parts of the pottage are evenly distributed and that no single spot on the bottom of the cauldron is allowed to grow too hot. She has been doing this for so many years that her body knows what to do without any instruction from her mind. Her arm moves in its steady rhythm while her thoughts drift, if they drift at all, toward the simple, peaceful emptiness that is the cook's own form of prayer. The priory around her has its own rhythms, and these too are a part of the slow stirring and the quiet mourning. Through the stone walls, softened by distance and by the thickness of the masonry, come the sounds of the other nuns going about their daily tasks. A sister passes the kitchen door on her way to the scriptorium. Her footsteps a soft, regular pad of leather shoes on stone, and you hear the faint rustle of her habit as she walks. Another sister is drawing water from the well, and the creak of the windlass and the splash of the bucket drift through the cold air of the cloister and into the kitchen, a sound that is so familiar to the cook that she probably does not consciously register it. In the scriptorium, a quill scratches across parchment, a tiny, delicate sound that would be inaudible anywhere else, but which travels through the silent stone corridors like a mouse rustling in the straw. The cook's paddle continues its slow, steady work, and these other sounds come and go, rising and fading, part of the fabric of the day. The chanting of sext is the next great marker of time, and when the bell begins to toll, its deep sonorous note vibrating through the stones, the cook pauses in her stirring and lifts her head. The bell tolls again and again, the sound spreading outward from the chapel tower across the cloister garth and the kitchen garden and the brown fields beyond, a sound that has called the faithful to prayer at this hour for centuries. The cook does not go to the chapel, but she hears the nuns gathering, the soft shuffle of their feet, the quiet murmur of voices as they take their places, and then the first notes of the chant rising up, a low, melodic hum that is exactly the same as the chanting of prime and terce and all the other hours. A sound that seems to come from the very stones of the Priory, so perfectly does it blend with the cold air and the grey light. The Latin words are indistinct, a slow-flowing river of sound that rises and falls in a pattern so old that no one alive remembers its beginning. The cook listens, her paddle still for a moment, and then she resumes her stirring, her movements matching the slow, steady pace of the chant, as if the two rhythms are one. Between the end of sext and the ringing of the next bell, there is a long, quiet space in which the Priory seems to hold its breath. The doves in the cloister garth coo softly, their voices a gentle bubbling sound that rises and falls in a lazy pattern. A hen scratches in the yard behind the kitchen, her claws making a soft, rhythmic scraping against the packed earth. The cook adds a small stick to the fire, watching it catch and flare, and then she returns to the cauldron to stir again, the paddle moving through the now quite thick pottage with a slow, deliberate motion that sends small, lazy bubbles rising to the surface. These bubbles are different from the quick, lively bubbles of the earlier simmer. They are heavy and slow, rising with a soft, liquid plop, and when they break, they leave behind a tiny crater in the surface of the pottage that slowly fills in as the thick liquid flows back together. The cook watches these bubbles, her eyes half closed, and you can see the way the light from the fire flickers on her face, creating soft, warm shadows that move with the flames. The consistency of the pottage has now reached a point where it is no longer a broth with vegetables in it, but something closer to a porridge, a thick, spoonable mass that will sustain the sisters through the rest of their day. The peas have almost entirely broken down, their skins now just soft, translucent fragments that drift in the thicker liquid, their interiors dissolved into the broth and giving it its creamy, substantial body. The broad beans are still whole for the most part, though they have swelled to twice their dry size and are now so soft that the paddle can cut through them with no effort at all. The turnip wedges have lost all their crispness and are now pale, soft shapes that are barely distinguishable from the broth, their edges blurred and rounded. The parsnip batons are similarly soft, their nutty sweetness now fully released into the surrounding liquid. The carrot rounds are the most resilient, still holding their shape and their orange color, but they too are tender, ready to yield to the slightest pressure. The herb bundle, now entirely spent, floats limply near the center of the pot. Its leaves are dull, washed-out green, its work done. The cook uses the paddle to lift a little of the pottage, tilting the blade so the thick liquid drips slowly back into the cauldron. She watches the way it falls, noting the consistency, the color, the way it clings to the wood. The color is a pale, earthy grey-brown, flecked with tiny bits of green from the herbs and the occasional brighter orange of a carrot. It is not a beautiful color, in the way that a painting or a sunset is beautiful, but it is a color that speaks of substance, of nourishment, of the simple, honest work of the kitchen. The cook seems satisfied because she nods slightly to herself and then returns the paddle to the pot, giving it one more slow circular stir before she steps back. The fire needs more wood, and she selects a piece from the pile, a split log of oak that is dense and heavy, its bark a rough, dark grey. She lays it carefully on the coals, and the fire accepts it with a soft, settling sound, the flames licking up around the new wood, testing it, then beginning to burn in earnest. The new heat is welcome because the kitchen, despite the warmth of the hearth, always carries a slight chill from the stone walls and the high ceiling, a chill that is never entirely banished, but only held at bay. The cook holds her hands out toward the flames for a moment, the heat warming her palms and her fingers, and then she turns back to the cauldron. The morning has now passed its midpoint, and the grey light through the window slit has grown just a little brighter, the clouds beginning to thin in some places so that a pale, watery sunlight filters through, casting faint, soft shadows on the kitchen floor. The cook looks up at the window, her face calm and unreadable, and then she walks over to the table where a clay jug of water sits. She pours some of the water into a small basin and washes her hands, the water cool and clean, and then she dries them on the corner of her apron. The cat at the hearth has woken and is now grooming itself, its pink tongue moving in slow, careful strokes over its grey fur. its eyes half closed in contentment. The cook watches the cat for a moment, and then she returns to her stool, settling herself for the final stretch of waiting before the midday meal. The sounds of the Priory continue in their familiar, muted way, the same sounds that have filled the kitchen all morning, the same sounds that will fill it all afternoon and all evening and all the days to come. The scratch of a quill, the footsteps of a nun, the cooing of the doves, the creak of the well-windlass, the distant murmur of voices in the chapel, all of these are woven together into a tapestry of quiet that is the true music of the Priory. The cook is a part of this tapestry, her stirring a part of its rhythm, her presence a part of its calm. She sits and stirs, and the pottage thickens, and the day moves on, and there is nothing in the world that needs to be done, except this, nothing that needs to be hurried or worried over, nothing that needs to be other than what it is. The slow stirring and the rhythm of the day continue, as they have continued for all the Lents that have come before, as they will continue for all the Lents that are yet to come, a quiet, steady thread of nourishment and peace running through the heart of the Priory. The cook has let the pottage simmer for a long while now, the legumes breaking down into softness, the root vegetables yielding their substance to the broth, the herbs giving up the last of their aromatic oils. What fills the cauldron is a thick, nourishing soup, but it is not yet complete, for the body of the pottage must be made substantial enough to sustain the sisters through a day of work and prayer. To achieve this, the cook will now add the barley meal, the coarse ground flour that has been waiting on the table in its linen bag since she brought it up from the undercroft early in the morning. She rises from her stool and crosses to the table, her wooden pattens making their soft, familiar sound on the worn stones, and she unties the knot she made earlier, the one she would recognize by touch alone. The linen bag opens, and she pours a generous measure of the barley meal into a deep wooden bowl, the flour falling in a soft, dusty stream that sends up a tiny cloud of fine particles to dance in the grey light from the window. The barley meal is not a fine white flour of the kind that might be used for delicate breads in a wealthy household. It is coarse and honest, the colour of pale sand, mixed with specks of darker brown from the bran that was not entirely sifted out. It has been ground at the watermill downstream, where the river turns the great wooden wheel, and it still carries a faint, dusty scent of the mill, of dry grain and old wood, and the cold, rushing water that powers the stones. The cook runs her fingers through the meal, feeling its texture, the slight grittiness against her skin, the way it clumps together softly when pressed and then crumbles apart again. It is a humble substance, the backbone of many a peasant meal, and in the Priory kitchen it serves the same purpose, to give weight and substance to the pottage, to make a little go a long way, to fill the stomach and warm the blood through the cold grey days of Lent. Rather than adding the barley meal directly to the main cauldron, where it might form lumps in the hot, thick broth, the cook takes a smaller iron pot from its hook on the wall and sets it on a trivet over a separate, smaller bed of coals that she rakes to one side of the main hearth. Into this smaller pot she pours a measure of clean water from the bucket. Not too much, but just enough to make a paste that can be smoothly incorporated into the larger pottage. The water in the small pot begins to warm almost immediately, the iron conducting the heat from the coals with its usual quiet efficiency, and small bubbles soon begin to form around the edges. The cook waits until the water is hot, but not boiling, the surface trembling with the promise of steam, and then she begins to add the barley meal. She does not pour it in all at once, which would surely create a gluey, unworkable mass, but takes pinches of the meal between her fingers and scatters it over the surface of the water, shaking her hand in a slow, steady motion that distributes the flour in a fine, even rain. Each pinch of meal hits the water and darkens instantly, sinking slightly before the cook stirs it in with a small, worn wooden spoon that she keeps for this very purpose. The stirring of the barley paste is a different kind of work from the slow, circular stirring of the main cauldron. Here, in the small pot, the motion is tighter, more focused, the spoon moving in quick, small circles that catch the meal before it can settle and combine it with the water into a smooth, thick paste. The cook's wrist turns with a practiced, economical motion, the spoon scraping the bottom and sides of the small pot, folding the meal into the water, working out any tiny lumps that try to form. The sound is a soft, wet, rhythmic shush, higher in pitch than the low murmur of the paddle in the cauldron, a delicate counterpoint that joins the kitchen's quiet music. The paste thickens as she stirs, the barley meal absorbing the water and swelling, the mixture turning from a thin, milky liquid into a thick, smooth, pourable substance that is the color of pale porridge. It steams gently, giving off a scent that is milder and sweeter than the savory smell of the pottage, a scent of cooked grain that is comforting and familiar. When the paste is perfectly smooth and free of lumps, the cook lifts the small pot from its trivet using a thick cloth to protect her hands from the hot iron handle, and she carries it the few steps to the main cauldron. The steam from the larger pot rises to meet her, and for a moment she is enveloped in the fragrant, savory cloud that has been building all morning. She tilts the small pot over the cauldron, and the barley paste begins to slide out, a thick, pale, glistening mass that moves slowly, like cooling lava, before it drops into the pottage with a soft, heavy sound. She uses the wooden spoon to scrape the last of the paste from the sides of the small pot, not wanting to waste any, and then she sets the empty pot aside on the stone ledge and takes up the long-handled paddle once more. Now begins the careful work of incorporating the barley paste into the pottage, a process that requires patience and a steady hand. The paste sits at first in a pale, thick clump near the center of the cauldron, reluctant to mix with the darker, thinner broth around it, but the cook does not rush. She slides the paddle into the pot and begins to stir in a wide, slow, figure-8 pattern that draws the broth toward the paste and the paste toward the broth, folding them together in a gentle, persistent motion that never breaks the surface into a splash. The paddle moves through the thickening liquid with a deeper, more muffled sound now, the resistance greater than it has been at any point earlier in the morning. The cook's arm works steadily, the muscles in her forearm moving under the skin, and you can see the way the effort is slightly greater, the stirring slightly slower, as the pottage grows heavier and more substantial. Gradually, the pale streak of the barley paste begins to disappear, its color blending into the grey-brown of the pottage, its substance dissolving into the larger mass of the cauldron. The pottage thickens visibly as this happens, the surface becoming more smooth and uniform, the bubbles rising more slowly and breaking with a heavier, more liquid sound. The cook continues to stir, the paddle tracing its patient path through the now quite dense mixture, and she watches the consistency with careful eyes, noting the way the pottage clings to the blade, the way it drops back into the pot in thick, slow sheets rather than thin streams. This is the transformation that the barley meal was meant to achieve. The pottage has moved from a soup through a stew and is now approaching something that could almost be called a porridge, a thick, spoonable food that will coat the stomach and provide warmth for hours. The color of the pottage has also changed with the addition of the barley meal. What was a grey-brown flecked with the green of herbs and the orange of carrots is now a paler, more uniform shade, the barley having lightened the whole, giving it a soft, milky quality that makes it look almost creamy despite containing no dairy at all. The surface of the pottage, when the paddle is still for a moment, reflects the firelight in a dull, soft gleam, a smooth, unbroken expanse of gentle warmth that seems to invite the spoon. The smell, too, has shifted, the savory notes of the vegetables and herbs now softened by the sweet, grainy scent of the barley, creating a fragrance that is round and complete, the smell of a finished meal rather than a work in progress. The cook lifts the paddle and holds it over the pot, letting a little of the pottage drip from the blade. The drops fall slowly, heavily, each one landing with a soft, distinct plop that sends a tiny, slow ripple across the surface. She watches the way the pottage behaves, the way it mounds slightly on the blade before falling, the way it holds its shape for a moment before settling, and she seems satisfied. But the pottage has become, if anything, slightly too thick, the barley meal having absorbed more liquid than she anticipated. This is easily remedied. She takes the wooden bucket, still half full of cold well water, and pours a small splash into the cauldron, the cold water hitting the hot surface with a brief, sharp hiss. She stirs it in with several slow, wide circles of the paddle, and the pottage loosens slightly, its consistency relaxing from a thick porridge back toward a substantial stew. She watches, stirs again, adds just a little more water, and then nods to herself, the adjustment complete. The pottage now at the perfect consistency for serving. The small iron pot that held the barley paste is now cooling on the stone ledge, and the cook picks it up and carries it to the table, where she pours a little water into it from the jug, swirling it around to loosen the last traces of paste from the sides. She scrapes the inside with the wooden spoon, then pours the cloudy water back into the main cauldron, unwilling to waste even a spoonful of the nourishment that the barley meal represents. This is the way of the Priory kitchen, where nothing is thrown away that can be used, where every grain of meal and every drop of broth is valued. The small pot is then set aside to be properly washed later, and the cook returns to the hearth. The pottage is now very near to being finished. The vegetables are soft and yielding, their individual shapes still discernible, but their substances merged into the larger whole. The legumes have broken down almost entirely, their starches dissolved into the broth, and their skins floating as soft, translucent fragments that add a subtle texture. The herbs have given all their flavor and sit spent in their bundle, which the cook fishes out with the paddle and sets aside on a wooden trencher to be discarded later. The barley meal has done its work, binding everything together into a unified, nourishing food. The fire continues to burn, but the cook now lets it die down slightly, the flame settling into a low, gentle glow that will keep the pottage warm without boiling it further. She stirs once more, a final, slow, circular motion that draws the paddle around the entire circumference of the cauldron, and then she rests the paddle on its ledge and steps back. The kitchen is quiet now, quieter than it has been all morning, as if the room itself is resting after the long, slow labor of the cooking. The cat still sleeps by the hearth, its grey fur rising and falling with its breath. The steam from the cauldron rises in a steady, gentle column, thinner now than before, carrying the completed scent of the pottage up into the rafters. The grey light through the window has grown a little brighter, the clouds having thinned enough to let a pale, watery sun cast faint shadows on the floor. The cook looks around the kitchen, her eyes moving from the table to the hearth to the window, and then she folds her hands over her apron and stands still, waiting for the bell that will soon ring to call the sisters to their midday meal. The barley meal has been added, the body of the pottage has been made complete, and there is nothing left to do but wait, and breathe, and listen to the quiet sounds of the Priory as the morning draws gently toward noon. The bell for the midday meal rings out from the small stone tower above the chapel, its deep, measured toll spreading through the Priory like ripples across a still pond. The sound reaches the kitchen, where it vibrates faintly in the iron of the cauldron and in the wooden handle of the paddle, and the cook lifts her head, her hands pausing in their slow, habitual tidying of the table. She has been waiting for this sound, and when it comes, her body moves into the next phase of the day's work, with the same unhurried, familiar grace that has marked every action since the fire was first lit in the dark hours before dawn. She wipes her hands on her apron, smoothing the coarse linen down over her habit, and she turns to the cauldron for what will be the final preparations before the meal is served. The pottage has been resting over the low, gentle heat of the dying fire, its surface now smooth and almost glassy except where a few slow, lazy bubbles rise and break with a soft, heavy plop. The cook takes up the paddle and gives the pot one last, slow stir, a wide, circular motion that folds the surface under and brings the deeper, warmer pottage up, ensuring that the temperature and consistency are even from top to bottom. The paddle moves through the thick, substantial liquid with a quiet, muffled sound, the resistance now familiar and predictable, and when she lifts the blade, the pottage clings to it in a thick, smooth layer that drips back into the cauldron in heavy, slow sheets. The scent that rises is complete and rounded, the sweet earthiness of the root vegetables, the creamy depth of the legumes, the aromatic lift of the herbs, and the mild, grainy warmth of the barley, all blended into a single, harmonious fragrance that fills the kitchen and drifts out through the open door into the cloister walk. The cook inhales this scent, her nostrils flaring slightly, and then she rests the paddle on its ledge and turns to gather the bowls. The bowls are stored on a long, low shelf near the kitchen door, a row of simple wooden vessels that have been turned from the wood of the Priory's own trees, their surfaces worn smooth by countless meals and countless washings. Each bowl is a slightly different shape, some deeper and narrower, others wider and shallower, but all are of a size that holds just enough for a single serving. The cook takes them down one by one, the wood cool and dry in her hands, and she stacks them carefully on the scrubbed oak table, the stack rising in a neat, steady column. There are enough bowls for all the sisters who will come to the midday meal, and the cook counts them with a quick, habitual glance, her lips moving slightly as she tallies the number. When the stack is complete, she lifts the entire pile, cradling it against her chest with one arm, while the other hand steadies the top, and she carries it across the kitchen to a small side table near the door that leads to the refectory. This is where the serving will be done, and she sets the bowls down in a neat row, their open mouths facing upward, waiting. Next, she takes a large wooden ladle from its hook on the wall, its handle long and smooth, its bowl deep and well-shaped for scooping. This ladle is a companion to the paddle, the two tools that have served the cook through all the meals of her years in the Priory, and it fits her hand as comfortably as the knife and the spoon. She dips the ladle into the cauldron, filling it with the thick, steaming pottage, and then she carries this first portion to the serving table. The ladle's contents are poured into the first bowl with a slow, careful tilt of the wrist, the pottage sliding out in a smooth, heavy mass that settles into the bowl and spreads to fill it, its surface leveling out with a gentle, liquid wobble. The steam rises from this first serving in a thin, steady wisp, and the cook pauses to look at it, checking that the consistency is right, that the color is even, that the portion is neither too large nor too small. Satisfied, she returns to the cauldron and fills a second bowl, and then a third, working her way down the row with the same slow, methodical pace that she has kept all day. The sound of the ladle against the iron cauldron is a soft, hollow clink, and the sound of the pottage pouring into the wooden bowls is a gentle, wet, plopping sound, repeated over and over as each bowl is filled. The cat, still curled near the hearth, lifts its head and watches these proceedings with the detached curiosity of its kind, its green eyes following the cook's movements for a moment before it yawns, stretches, and settles back into sleep. The cook does not hurry, even though the bell has rung, and the sisters will soon be gathering. There is time enough, and the pottage will stay warm in its cauldron while she works. Each bowl receives the same careful attention, the ladle dipping to the same depth, the pour executed with the same steady hand, so that every sister will receive an equal portion, no one receiving more or less than her due. As the bowls are filled, the cook also prepares the refectory in small, quiet ways. She carries a stack of wooden spoons to the long tables, laying one beside each place where a sister will sit. The spoons are simple and worn, their handles darkened by use, their shallow bowls shaped to fit the mouth. She checks that the benches are straight, that the water jugs on the tables are filled, that the rough linen napkins are folded. The refectory is a long, high-ceilinged room with a stone floor and bare walls, its windows narrow and set high, letting in the pale grey light of the overcast midday. The long tables run the length of the room, their surfaces scrubbed to a pale silvery grey, the wood worn smooth by the sliding of bowls and the resting of elbows over many years. At the far end of the room, on a slightly raised platform, stands the table where the prioress will sit, and beside it, a lectern where the reader will stand to recite the holy text during the meal. The cook moves through this space with the same quiet presence she brings to the kitchen, her footsteps soft on the stone, her hands busy with the small tasks that make the meal possible. The sisters begin to arrive, not all at once but in a slow, steady stream, their habits rustling softly as they walk, their voices silent as the rule requires during this part of the day. They enter through the main door of the refectory, each one pausing to dip her fingers in the small stone bowl of holy water by the entrance and to make the sign of the cross, a brief, quiet gesture before she takes her place at the long table. They move with the same unhurried pace that characterizes all the life of the Priory, their faces calm and their eyes lowered, their hands folded inside their sleeves. No one speaks, for the meal is taken in silence, as is the custom during Lent, and the only sounds are the soft scuff of their leather shoes on the stone floor, the rustle of their woolen habits, and the occasional dry, quiet cough. The cook watches them arrive from the doorway between the kitchen and the refectory, her ladle resting in her hand, waiting until all the sisters are in their places and the prioress has taken her seat at the high table. When everyone is settled, the reader rises and walks to the lectern, a young nun with a calm, clear voice that will carry through the long room without straining. She opens the large, leather-bound book that rests on the wooden stand, its pages crackling softly as she turns them, and she begins to read. Her voice is steady and melodic, the Latin words flowing out in a slow, rhythmic stream that has the cadence of a lullaby, though the meaning of the words is a matter of scripture and contemplation. The sound fills the refectory and drifts into the kitchen, where the cook listens for a moment. The familiar words are kind of music that she has heard 1,000 times before. Then she turns back to the serving table, and with the help of a younger lay sister who has appeared at her elbow, she begins to carry the filled bowls to the tables. The serving is done with the same quiet, deliberate care that has marked every step of the day. The cook carries 2 bowls at a time, one in each hand, walking slowly along the length of the long table, pausing beside each sister to set a bowl before her. The sisters do not look up, their eyes fixed on their places or closed in silent prayer, but there is a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement, a slight inclination of the head, a soft movement of the hands that passes between the server and the served. The bowls are set down with a gentle, soft clunk, the sound of wood on wood, and then the cook moves on to the next sister and the next until every place has its portion of pottage. The younger lay sister follows behind with a basket of coarse brown bread, thick slices cut from the loaf that was baked the previous day, now slightly stale, but perfectly suited for dipping into the thick, warm pottage. Each sister takes a piece, her fingers closing around the rough, dark crust, and the basket moves on. The steam rises from the bowls along the table, a series of thin, gentle columns that merge into a soft haze in the cool air of the refectory. The scent of the pottage fills the room now, the sweet, earthy, herbal fragrance that the cook has been living with all morning, and it mingles with the faint, dusty smell of the old books and the clean, cold scent of the stone walls. The sisters wait until everyone has been served, their hands resting in their laps, their heads bowed, and when the prioress gives a small silent signal, they begin to eat. The sound of the meal is a soft, collective murmur, the clink of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, the quiet, wet sound of the pottage being lifted and swallowed, the occasional soft crunch of the bread crust yielding to the teeth. It is a sound of quiet, humble consumption, a sound without greed or haste, a sound that is as much a part of the Priory's rhythm as the bells and the chanting. The cook stands in the doorway between the kitchen and the refectory, her hands now empty, her apron stained with the small splashes of a morning's work, and she watches the sisters eat. Her face is calm, her eyes moving slowly along the long tables, noting who is eating well and who is picking at their food, though she will never say a word about it. There is a quiet satisfaction in watching others consume what she has prepared, a satisfaction that is not pride, for pride has no place in the Priory, but something closer to a quiet, deep contentment, the knowledge that her work has provided the nourishment that will carry these women through the rest of their day. She sees one of the older nuns, a woman whose hands are gnarled with age and whose back is bent from years of work and prayer, lift a spoonful of the pottage to her lips with a hand that trembles slightly, and the cook watches as the pottage is eaten, as the bowl slowly empties, as the color returns faintly to the older woman's cheeks. This is why she stirred the pot since before prime. This is why she gathered the peas and beans from the undercroft and the herbs from the garden. This is why she stood over the fire in the steam through the long, quiet morning. The meal continues, the reader's voice rising and falling in its steady, melodic cadence, the spoons moving from bowl to mouth to bowl again, the bread crumbling and being dipped into the last of the pottage, the faint, soft sound of wooden bowls being tilted to catch the final spoonful. When the prioress sets down her spoon, the others follow, the signal passing silently down the tables, and the sisters fold their hands once more, while the reader finishes the passage. Then there is a moment of silence, a brief collective prayer of thanks, and the sisters rise from the benches and file out of the refectory in the same slow, quiet order in which they arrived. The meal is over. The cook moves back into the refectory now, with the young lay sister at her side, and they begin the work of clearing the tables. The bowls are collected, stacked carefully, carried back to the kitchen where they will be washed with ashen water and set to dry on the wooden rack. The spoons are gathered, the napkins shaken out, the bread basket refilled for the evening collation. The cook works in silence, her movements as slow and steady as ever, though there is perhaps a slight weariness in the way she rolls her shoulders, a small acknowledgement of the hours she has spent on her feet. She scrapes the last remnants of pottage from the bowls into a small bucket that will be taken to the hens, who will peck at the softened vegetables and legumes with their quick, sharp beaks. Nothing is wasted, not a spoonful, not a crumb. When the refectory is tidy and the kitchen is returning to its quiet order, the cook goes back to the cauldron, which still sits over the dying fire, now only half full of the pottage that remains. The surface of the pottage has developed a thin, wrinkled skin during the serving, and she breaks it with the paddle, stirring once more before she covers the cauldron loosely with a clean, damp cloth to keep the flies away, though there are no flies in this cold grey season. The fire is allowed to die down further, the coals spreading into a low, even bed of orange and grey that will keep the kitchen warm through the early afternoon. The cook wipes her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a small smudge of soot on her brow that she does not notice, and then she walks to the doorway and looks out into the cloister, where the grey light still falls softly on the bare grass of the garth, and the doves still coo in the shelter of the roof. The midday meal has been served, the sisters have been fed, and the long, slow afternoon stretches out before her, quiet and still. The midday meal is over, and the refectory has returned to its quiet, empty state. The long table's bare now, except for the faint, damp marks where the wooden bowls rested and the occasional crumb of brown bread that has yet to be swept away. The cook moves through this silence with the same unhurried steps she has used all day, her body perhaps a little heavier now with the weight of the hours spent standing, but her movements still steady and deliberate. The young lay sister who helped with the serving has gone to her own rest, and the cook is alone once more in the kitchen, the familiar space that has held her through the long morning and that will hold her through the quiet afternoon to come. The fire has been allowed to die down to a low, gentle bed of glowing coals, the flames having given way to a deep, still heat that radiates from the hearth in soft, invisible waves, and the great cauldron, now half empty, sits on its trivet with the remaining pottage cooling slowly beneath the damp cloth that covers it. The cook goes first to the cauldron, lifting a corner of the cloth to peer inside. The pottage has settled during the serving, its surface now smooth and slightly dimpled where the last bubbles broke, and a thin, translucent skin has already begun to form across the top, a delicate membrane that wrinkles when she touches it with the tip of the paddle. She breaks this skin with a gentle stir, folding it back into the warm mass below, and then she replaces the cloth, tucking the edges down around the rim of the iron to keep the pottage clean and protected. The remaining pottage will serve for the evening collation, a light meal taken after Vespers, and it will need only a gentle reheating later in the day. The cauldron, its work now suspended rather than finished, settles into its afternoon rest, the iron ticking softly as it cools, a faint, metallic sound that is the only voice it ever speaks. With the cauldron tended, the cook turns her attention to the tools and vessels that have served her through the morning. The long-handled wooden paddle is first. She takes it from its resting place on the stone ledge and carries it to the wooden bucket of water that still stands in the corner, now no longer cold, but tepid from the warmth of the kitchen. She dips a rough cloth into the water and begins to wipe the paddle down, her fingers moving along the smooth, worn blade, removing the thin, sticky film of pottage that clings to the wood. The cloth moves in slow, circular strokes, the same patient motion she used for stirring, and the wood gradually emerges clean and pale, its grain visible beneath the dark, seasoned surface. She dries the paddle with a second cloth, a scrap of coarse linen kept for this purpose, and then she hangs it on its hook on the wall, where it will wait until the evening meal, and then through the night until tomorrow's fire is lit. The ladle receives the same careful attention, its deep bowl swished in the water to loosen any pottage that has dried in the crevice where the bowl meets the handle. The cook uses a small twig brush, its bristles worn short, to scrub gently at the joint, and then she rinses the ladle and dries it, hanging it beside the paddle on its own. Smaller hook. The wooden bowls that were used for the meal are already stacked near the washing basin, and she turns to them now, filling the large, shallow stone sink with water from the bucket, and adding a handful of clean grey wood ash from a small pot on the shelf. The ash mixes with the water to form a thin, gritty paste, a simple and effective cleaner that has been used in kitchens since long before this priory was built, and the cook begins to wash each bowl in turn. The ash scrub makes a soft, gritty sound against the wood, the bowls turning in her hands as she works the paste into the grain, and then each bowl is rinsed in clean water and set on a wooden rack to dry. The bowls drip quietly, the water falling in slow, fat drops onto the stones below, a soft, irregular rhythm that joins the other quiet sounds of the kitchen. The spoons are washed next, their small, shallow bowls easy to clean with a quick pass of the ash paste and a rinse, and they are laid out on a clean cloth to dry, their handles all pointing in the same direction. The cook works through the stack of bowls and spoons with the same steady, methodical pace she has maintained all day, and though the work is simple and repetitive, she does not rush it, because even the washing of bowls is a task that deserves attention, a part of the rhythm of the Priory that matters as much as any other. When the last spoon is clean and the last bowl is on the rack, she empties the ash water into a slop bucket that will be taken to the garden later, where the ash will sweeten the soil, and she wipes down the stone sink until it is smooth and dry. The table where the vegetables were prepared earlier is now wiped clean, the damp cloth moving across the scrubbed oak in long, slow sweeps that collect the last crumbs of soil and the tiny fragments of onion skin that escaped the earlier tidying. The cook gathers these scraps into her hand and drops them into the compost bucket, and then she stands back, surveying the kitchen with the quiet, appraising look of someone who knows every corner of this room and can tell at a glance whether anything is out of place. The kitchen is, for now, in order, the table is clean, the shelves are tidy, the cauldron is covered, the tools are hanging on their hooks, and the fire is a low, warm glow that requires no attention. There is nothing more that needs to be done in this moment, and so the cook, for the first time since she rose in the darkness before prime, allows herself to rest. She does not go far. There is a corner of the cloister walk, just outside the kitchen door, where a low stone bench is being placed against the south-facing wall, a spot that catches the thin, pale sunlight when it breaks through the clouds, and that is sheltered from the wind by the bulk of the Priory building. The cook unties her apron, folding it loosely over her arm, and she steps out of the kitchen into the cloister walk, the cold air meeting her face with a gentle, fresh shock after the warmth of the hearth. She walks the few steps to the stone bench and sits down, her back resting against the rough, cool limestone of the wall, her hands folding in her lap over the folded apron. The bench is cold through her habit, but she does not seem to mind, and after a moment the stone begins to warm slightly from the heat of her body, becoming less of a chill and more of a solid, steady support. From this spot, the cook can see the cloister garth, the small central courtyard with its square of rough grass and its single bare apple tree that stands in the very centre, its branches a dark, twisted lace against the grey sky. The grass is still brown from the winter, flattened in places where the frost has lain heavily, but there are tiny signs of the coming spring if one knows where to look. A faint, greenish haze at the base of the thicker clumps, a few small pale shoots pushing up through the dead thatch. The doves have come down from the roof and are walking on the grass with their delicate bobbing steps, their heads turning this way and that, their soft grey bodies blending into the grey of the stone and the grey of the sky. They coo to one another, a soft bubbling sound that rises and falls in a lazy, contented rhythm, and the cook watches them with eyes that are calm and still, her mind neither empty nor full, but somewhere in between, resting in the way that the body rests when there is no demand upon it. The Priory is quiet around her, quieter even than during the morning, for this is the hour of the afternoon rest, the brief interval between the work of the day and the prayers of Vespers. The nuns are in their cells or in the chapter house, some reading, some dozing, some simply sitting in the same kind of stillness that the cook now inhabits. The only sounds are the soft, distant scratching of the hens in the yard behind the barn, the faint rustle of the wind through the bare branches of the hawthorn hedge, and the occasional far-off call of a crow from the woods beyond the Priory fields. The cook listens to these sounds without listening, her breathing slow and even, her shoulders dropping slightly as the tension of the morning's work eases out of them. She has been on her feet since before dawn, lifting buckets and stirring pottage and carrying bowls, and now her body welcomes the stillness, the simple, quiet rest of sitting on a stone bench in the pale grey light of a Lenten afternoon. The cat has followed her from the kitchen, slipping through the slightly open door with its silent, fluid grace, and it now jumps up onto the bench beside her, curling into a tight grey ball with its tail wrapped around its nose. The cook looks down at the cat, and the faintest hint of something soft passes over her face, Not quite a smile, but something close to it. A quiet, private affection that she would never express in words. She does not reach out to stroke the cat, for her hands are folded in her lap, but she does not move away either, and the two of them sit together on the cold stone bench, the woman and the cat, sharing the stillness of the afternoon. Time passes, though it is hard to say how much, for the grey light does not change and the bells do not ring, and there is nothing to mark the slow slide of the sun behind the thick, unchanging clouds. The cook's head bows slightly, her chin dropping toward her chest, and for a moment it seems that she might be falling asleep, but she is not. She is simply resting her eyes, her mind drifting in a state that is not quite waking and not quite dreaming, a state that is as deep and still as the water in the well. The sounds of the Priory continue around her, soft and muted, the scratching of the hens, the cooing of the doves, and then a new sound joins them, the distant, faint murmur of a sister practicing chant in the chapel, her voice rising and falling in a slow, melodic exercise that repeats the same phrase over and over, each iteration a little smoother, a little more pure. The cook hears this sound and it blends into her rest, becoming part of the fabric of the quiet afternoon, neither disturbing her nor demanding her attention. After a while, she lifts her head and looks around the cloister, her eyes moving slowly over the familiar stones, the familiar arches, the familiar grey sky. She is not yet ready to return to the kitchen, for there is nothing there that needs her, but she knows that the afternoon is moving on and that soon she will need to reheat the pottage and prepare for the evening collation. Not yet, though. For now she remains on the bench, her back against the stone, her hands in her lap, her breathing slow and even, the cat warm beside her. The kitchen behind her is quiet and orderly, the cauldron resting under its cloth, the paddle and ladle hanging on their hooks, the washed bowls drying on their rack. The pottage sits in its iron vessel, half cooled now, its surface growing a fresh, thin skin that will be broken when the fire is rekindled. The fire itself is a low orange glow, a heap of coals that will easily spring back to life with the addition of a little dry wood. Everything is in its place, and the cook, for this brief, quiet interval, is not a cook, but simply a woman sitting on a bench, watching the doves on the grass and listening to the distant chant and feeling the cold, fresh air on her face. The apple tree in the center of the garth sways very slightly in a breeze that is barely strong enough to move its branches, the twigs clicking softly against one another with a sound like tiny, distant finger cymbals. The cook watches the tree, and perhaps she thinks about the apples that will hang from its branches in the autumn, the small, sour apples that are used for verjuice or dried for winter storage, or perhaps she thinks about nothing at all, her mind as bare and peaceful as the branches themselves. The afternoon quiet and the cauldron's rest are one and the same thing, a pause in the rhythm of the day that is as necessary as the work itself, a space of stillness between the meal that has been served and the meal that is yet to come, and the cook, who has worked steadily since the dark hours before dawn, gives herself to this stillness without resistance, without guilt, without any thought that she should be doing something else. She has done her work, and now she rests, and the Priory rests with her, the stones and the grass and the doves and the cat, all held in the same gentle, quiet pause. The afternoon stillness stretches on in its quiet, unhurried way, the grey light over the cloister garth, neither brightening nor fading. The doves still walking their slow, bobbing paths across the brown grass, the cat still curled in its tight, warm ball on the stone bench beside the cook. But the cook knows, with the quiet instinct that comes from years of measuring time by the subtle shifts of the Priory's rhythms rather than by any clock, that the hour of vespers is drawing near. She feels it in the slight deepening of the chill in the air, in the way the pale light through the clouds has begun to lose its silvery quality and take on a softer, more muted tone, and in the faint stirring of activity that is beginning to ripple through the Priory as the nuns prepare for the next office. She lifts her head, her eyes moving slowly across the familiar stones of the cloister walk, and she draws a deep, slow breath of the cold, fresh air, as if storing up the stillness of the afternoon to carry with her into the evening's work. The cat stirs as she moves, uncurling itself with a lazy, luxurious stretch, its front paws reaching out and its claws extending briefly before retracting again. The cook rises from the bench, her apron still folded over her arm, and she pauses for a moment to look down at the animal, her face calm and unreadable. Then she turns and walks back along the cloister walk toward the kitchen door, her wooden pattens making their soft rhythmic sound on the worn flagstones, the cold air nipping gently at her cheeks and the tips of her fingers. The kitchen door opens with its familiar, heavy clunk, and she steps back into the warmth, into the smell of wood smoke and cooling pottage and damp stone, into the dim, golden light of the hearth where the coals still glow with their deep, steady orange. The kitchen is exactly as she left it, the cauldron covered with its damp cloth, the paddle and ladle hanging on their hooks, the washed bowls drying on their rack, the scrubbed table bare and clean. The cook shakes out her apron and ties it around her waist once more, the familiar weight of the coarse linen settling against her habit, and then she goes to the hearth to begin the evening's work. The fire has died down to a bed of coals that are mostly grey on the surface, but still glow with a deep, warm heart when she stirs them gently with the iron poker, the grey ash falling away to reveal the orange and red beneath. She selects a few small sticks from the wood pile, dry and thin, and lays them carefully on the coals, then bends down to blow softly, her breath a steady, gentle stream that coaxes the flames back to life. The sticks catch with a soft crackling sound, the tiny flames licking up and growing stronger, and soon the fire is burning again. A smaller, more modest fire than the one that roared through the morning, but enough to reheat the pottage and warm the kitchen through the evening. The cook turns to the cauldron and lifts the damp cloth, folding it and setting it aside on the stone ledge. The pottage beneath has cooled during the afternoon, its surface now covered with a thicker, more substantial skin that has formed as the starch is settled and the heat slowly left the iron. The skin is wrinkled and slightly darker than the pottage beneath, and the cook breaks it with the paddle in a slow, gentle motion, folding it back into the mass below where it dissolves and blends with the rest. The pottage is still thick, perhaps even thicker than it was at midday, having continued to absorb its own moisture during the resting hours, and the cook knows that it will need a little water to loosen it before the evening meal. She pours a small splash from the bucket, the water hitting the surface with a soft hiss, and then she begins to stir, the paddle moving in its familiar, slow, circular path, the pottage gradually warming and loosening as the fire does its quiet work. The scent of the pottage, which had faded during the afternoon into a faint background note, now begins to rise again as the reheating progresses, filling the kitchen with its familiar, comforting fragrance. It is the same scent that has been present all day, the sweet earthiness of the root vegetables, the creamy depth of the legumes, the aromatic lift of the herbs, the mild, grainy warmth of the barley. But now it carries an additional note, a slight toasty richness that comes from the gentle reheating, a deepening of the flavors that have had the afternoon to meld and settle together. The cook stirs and watches, her face calm, her body moving in the same slow rhythm, and gradually the pottage comes back to a gentle, steaming warmth, the bubbles rising slowly to the surface, the consistency loosening to a smooth, spoonable thickness that is just right for the light evening collation. The bell for vespers begins to toll, its deep resonant note spreading through the priory as the light outside the window slit begins its slow, imperceptible fade toward dusk. The cook pauses in her stirring, the paddle resting against the rim of the cauldron, and she listens to the bell, her head slightly tilted, her hands folded over the handle. The sound is the same as it has been for every office of the day, the same deep measured tolling that has marked the hours since before prime, but now it carries a different quality, a softer, more solemn tone that seems to match the deepening grey of the sky and the quiet settling of the priory into its evening rhythm. The nuns will be gathering in the chapel, their habits rustling softly, their voices joining in the ancient chant that has been sung at this hour for centuries, and the cook, though she will not be with them, will hear their voices drifting through the stone walls as she works. She returns her attention to the pottage, giving it a final slow stir, and then she fills the ladle once more, carrying the first portion to the serving table, where the wooden bowls have been laid out again, clean and dry from their afternoon on the rack. The evening collation is a simpler affair than the midday meal, a light repast taken in the refectory after vespers, just enough to sustain the sisters through the night until the morning meal. The cook fills the bowls with the same careful, steady hand, the pottage pouring in slow, heavy streams, the steam rising from each bowl in a thin, gentle wisp. The portions are slightly smaller this time, for the rule of Lent is frugal, and the evening meal is meant only to prevent the distraction of hunger during the long night hours, and the cook measures each serving with the same quiet precision she has used all day. Through the walls, the sound of vespers begins, the nuns' voices rising in the familiar, melodic chant that has been a part of the Priory's life since its founding. The Latin words drift through the stone corridors and into the kitchen, their meaning indistinct but their sound as clear and pure as the cold air outside, a slow-flowing river of melody that rises and falls in a pattern as old as the hills. The cook listens as she works, her movements slowing to match the pace of the chant, the ladle dipping and pouring in a rhythm that seems to follow the same gentle, unhurried beat. The kitchen, the refectory, the chapel, the whole Priory is held in this single, unified moment. The work of the hands and the work of the voice, both part of the same quiet devotion, the same steady, patient offering of the day to something greater than themselves. When the bowls are filled and the Vespers chant has reached its final fading notes, the cook carries the bowls into the refectory, where the sisters will soon arrive for the collation. The long room is even dimmer now than it was at midday, the high windows letting in only the pale greyish light of the fading afternoon, and the shadows have gathered in the corners and along the stone walls, soft and deep. The cook sets the bowls on the long tables, one at each place, and she checks that the water jugs are filled, that the napkins are folded, that the small basket of bread is ready. Then she returns to the kitchen doorway and waits, her hands folded over her apron as the sisters file in from the chapel, their faces calm and their eyes still carrying the quiet focus of the prayer they have just completed. The collation is brief and silent, the sisters eating their small portions of pottage with the same slow, deliberate care they showed at midday, the spoons moving from bowl to mouth, the bread dipped and eaten, the water sipped from the rough clay cups. The reader does not read at this meal, for the evening collation is a time of complete silence, a time for each sister to be alone with her thoughts, even as she sits among her community. The only sounds are the soft, wet noises of eating, the occasional scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the quiet rustle of a sleeve as a sister reaches for the water jug. The cook watches from the doorway, her face calm and her body still, and when the prioress sets down her spoon and the sisters rise to leave, she moves forward to begin the final clearing of the day. The bowls are collected, the spoons gathered, the napkins shaken and folded, the bread basket returned to the kitchen shelf. The cook works alone now, the young lay sister having retired for the night, and her movements are slower than they were in the morning. A slight weariness beginning to show in the way she pauses between tasks, in the way she rolls her shoulders with a soft, quiet sigh. But she does not complain, for weariness is a part of the day's work, as natural and as acceptable as the cold of the morning or the grey of the sky. And she carries on with the same steady, methodical pace, washing the bowls and spoons with the ash paste, rinsing them in clean water, setting them on the rack to dry through the night. The kitchen is tidied, the table wiped down, the scraps collected for the hens, the compost bucket set by the door to be taken to the heap in the morning. Now the cook turns to the cauldron for the final time. The pottage is nearly finished, only a small amount remaining at the bottom of the great iron vessel, just enough to be scraped out and set aside. She uses the paddle to scoop the last of the pottage into a small earthenware crock, which she covers with a piece of oiled linen, and sets on a cool stone shelf where it will keep through the night and provide a small meal for herself and the lay sister tomorrow. The cauldron, now empty, is scraped clean with the paddle, the last bits of pottage loosened from the curved iron bottom, and then she pours a little water into it, swirling it around to lift any remaining residue. This water will be poured into the hen's bucket, for even the washings of the pot contain nourishment for the animals, and nothing in the Priory kitchen is ever truly wasted. With the cauldron empty and clean, the cook turns her attention to the fire, which is burned down once more to a bed of glowing coals. The night fire must be banked carefully, so that it will survive the long cold hours until morning and be ready to spring back to life when the cook returns before prime. She uses the iron poker to rake the coals into a compact, even mound at the center of the hearth, pressing them gently together so that they will burn slowly through the night, their heat conserved rather than scattered, Then she takes a small shovel and scoops a layer of cold grey ash from the edges of the hearth, sprinkling it over the mound of coals in a thin, even blanket that will hold in the warmth and prevent the fire from burning out too quickly. Finally, she adds a scattering of dry peat dust, a dark crumbly powder that smoulders slowly and helps to keep the heart of the fire alive. The coals glow faintly through the ash, a dim orange-red pulse that is just barely visible, and the cook nods to herself, satisfied that the fire will last until the morning. Now she goes to the table where the dried peas for tomorrow's pottage have been waiting in their linen bag. She pours a measure of the peas into a wooden bowl, the same quantity she used this morning, and she covers them with cold water from the bucket, the water rising over the peas and turning faintly cloudy as the dust of the storage crock is loosened. The peas will soak through the night, swelling and softening, and in the morning they will be ready to be rinsed and added to the new day's pottage. She sets the bowl on the cool stone shelf beside the crock of leftover pottage, where it will be safe from mice and undisturbed through the dark hours. This is the last act of preparation, the final task of the day, the small, hopeful gesture that looks forward to tomorrow, even as today draws to its quiet close. The cook unties her apron, folding it carefully and hanging it on its wooden peg near the door, where it will wait for her return. She washes her hands and face in the basin of clean water, the cold water a small shock against her warm skin, and she dries herself with a rough linen cloth, the fabric scratching gently against her cheeks. Then she looks around the kitchen one last time, her eyes moving slowly over the hearth, the cauldron, the table, the shelves, the rack of drying bowls, the cat that has returned and is now curled once more in its warm spot near the banked fire. Everything is in order. Everything is ready for the night. Everything is at peace. The rushlights in the corridor have been lit, their small, flickering flames casting soft, dancing shadows on the stone walls as the cook leaves the kitchen and walks slowly along the cloister walk toward the dormitory. The air is colder now, the grey of the sky having deepened to a soft, velvety darkness that is not quite black, but a deep, muted blue-grey, and the first faint stars are beginning to appear in the gaps between the caps between the clouds. The doves have gone to their roosts, the hens have settled in their coop, and the priory is wrapped in a profound, enveloping silence that is broken only by the soft pad of the cook's leather shoes on the flagstones and the distant rhythmic hoot of an owl in the woods beyond the fields. The cook walks slowly, her body tired but her mind calm, and she passes the chapel where a single candle still burns near the altar, its tiny flame a point of warm golden light in the vast darkness of the stone interior. Her cell is small and simple, a narrow room with a low ceiling and a single high window that looks out onto the darkening sky. There is a wooden bed with a straw mattress and a rough woolen blanket, a small stool, a wooden cross on the wall, and nothing else. The cook enters, closing the heavy wooden door behind her with a soft, final clunk, and she sits on the edge of the bed for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing slow and deep. The day has been long, but it has been good, a day of quiet work and simple nourishment, a day like so many others that have come before and so many that will come after, each one the same and each one different, each one a small quiet offering of patience and care. She kneels briefly beside the bed, her lips moving in a silent prayer, and then she rises, removes her outer habit, and lies down beneath the rough blanket, her head sinking into the straw pillow. The last thing she hears before sleep takes her is the faint, distant hoot of the owl and the soft, regular breathing of the priory settling into its night, and the last thing she sees in her mind's eye is the great cauldron, dark and quiet in the kitchen below, holding within its iron walls the warmth of the day just past, a vessel of sleep and of simple sustenance awaiting the morrow.